What's up, everybody? Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are live for episode 7 of Roster Locked, a best ball show. My guest tonight is none other than Shawn Siegele of RotoViz, the original author of the Zero RB article. Obviously, a very popular topic amongst the Twitterverse even today. We're going to be drafting a FFPC Best Ball Tournament team. When they first announced the tournament, I didn't think there was a better person I could ask on than Shawn. So we've been kind of game planning in the background a little bit. We're ready to get this thing started. Shawn, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure speaking to you for the first time and also having a chance to draft with you.
Yeah, well, it's exciting. It should be great. I'm happy to be on the show and doing these drafts. I'm looking forward to hopefully doing quite a few. This is a great format. I think a lot of fun in a variety of different ways. And we'll talk today about how we can try and win our individual league, advance into that playoff section, and then have a team that also would have a chance to win the $100,000. So yeah, should be fun.
Yeah, it's going to be a really good time. Earlier this week, for those of you who are subscribers to RotoViz, you may have noticed that we put out 2 articles earlier kind of touching on some of the topics of this tournament in particular. Shawn also did a few articles as well that you should definitely head over to RotoViz and check out. The first article that I touched on, which I think kind of is a good way to just lay ground to what we're going to be looking to accomplish tonight, and then obviously over the course of the next several months as we draft these teams, is certain things as it pertains to the schedule and then how the tournament is also laid out, Shawn, because this is a little bit unique of the tournament compared to some other mass entry tournaments that we see in the best ball format. I'll kind of give you the floor just to talk about it, lay out some of the rules for what we talked about in that first article, and give people a little bit of information on that before we get started.
Yeah, so this is an interesting format because you have to advance through the regular season, make that first 13 weeks, have a strong enough roster to get into the playoff portion. And then the playoff portion is really 4 separate weeks, starting week 14 and finishing week 17. So you need to have a top couple team to advance that top team to win the $100,000. That creates some interesting gameplay because some of the things that we do for trying to win an individual week will be a little bit different than what we do for trying to win for the full season. And so as we put together a roster today, we're trying to make sure that we have the upside necessary to win in those playoff weeks and to have the high scores in those playoff weeks while our overall roster is strong enough to get there in the first place. I think some of the things people can do to try and win the $100,000 in week 17 can put them in a pretty bad position to make it through that first 13 weeks.
Yeah, I think that really one of the things, like you said, stood out was just the overall format and the way that it's arranged. Particularly one thing that we had talked about was week 14 a little bit because of how that actually falls into the playoff schedule. And we have a handful of teams that are going to be popping up on week 14 buys when we are in the first week of the playoffs. I know that the teams that we had looked at were, I believe, the Eagles and the Colts, and there was 2 or 3 other teams, so I can't quite remember off the top of my head. I need to pull it up. But essentially players who we may, obviously they're going to be drafted, but we may be looking to actively avoid because we don't want to lose key players with high draft capital so early on into the first week of the playoffs. It kind of doesn't really do us much good if we're going to get into the playoffs and then lose one of our first round or second round picks to that bye week. We don't want to lose that way. We don't want to go out like that. So I thought that was really interesting. And another thing that we had talked about as well was kind of being mindful of week 17, which is obviously the final week of the tournament. And in that, we had kind of looked at different games that we thought maybe offered some higher scoring upside than others in hopes of maybe stacking or pairing teams within those games to hopefully capitalize on the assumption that we are in fact going to be in this championship game, which if you know what we're going to do here tonight is we're going to be gunning for $100,000. So I expect us to be in that championship game. Shawn's going to help get us there. Shawn, was there any particular game in that week 17 slate that stood out to you perhaps over some of the other ones?
Well, a couple of the teams that we have talked about and that you had talked about in your article, looking at that Dallas-Arizona game and looking at the Bengals with the Chiefs. Those are a couple of games that could blow up and be extremely high scoring. So if you had a team that used those guys together, then perhaps that would be the type of roster that would score big in week 17. Now, we also know that we have to get there, and you talked about week 14. The player who's really disappointing to lose, I think, at this point is that Jonathan Taylor, right? So team going to be on the week 14 bye. We had the 4th pick. Probably he would not be in the mix for that slot already since you have a couple of running backs who are above him there. At the same time, I know Colin Kelly, my co-host for RotoViz Overtime, loves Taylor. I think overall Taylor probably deserves to be drafted a little bit higher, but now in this particular format, it becomes less of a thing of do we want to reach for him?
Yeah, I mean, if obviously we played fantasy enough to know that injuries during a crucial point of the season are obviously more devastating than something in the regular season if it's a short-term injury. Drafting some of these players in week 14 during that first round of playoffs is kind of almost like losing a player to injury in a critical part of your schedule. So it's not something that we really want to have to deal with, and just something that we're going to be hopefully actively looking to avoid. I did want to pull it up really quickly here because I did look at it for week 14. I thought that we had found it in there. Now I think I need to scroll up a little bit higher. But yeah, so it was Jonathan Taylor who is going to be out. Obviously, he's Colts. Eagles, Miles Sanders, we had pointed out as a pick we don't really want to use. And then the other teams are the Patriots. We don't really have a lot of players who necessarily have the high draft capital that we're necessarily talking about here, but it's important to maybe consider when you're thinking of things in terms of stacking and trying to get perhaps a right pairing of players to make a run at this thing. And then the Dolphins, who again, not a lot of high draft capital necessarily in these drafts, but again, some decent pieces who you could be essentially looking to stack with, where if you get too ahead of yourself, you might have a large portion of your team out during these buys. So so we had covered a little bit of that. And then in the second article, we took a look at a couple different stacks. I'm just going to pull it up real quick, where this was more about finding stacks that would bend but not break, and some that could possibly win it all, where we just focused on essentially some of the historical stacks that we've seen work out over time. Some of them hit in tremendous ways. Patrick Mahomes in 2018 with guys like Kelsey and Tyreek Hill obviously did you a favor if you had them on your team. But there are other stacks that we can look to acquire in this draft. And quite frankly, Shawn, we kind of laid it all out here. Some things that we talked about behind the scenes, we put in these articles and talked about. What are we looking to do perhaps when we're trying to build stacks in this particular format?
Well, one of the elements that we have to look at, and you can pull this up in the Best Ball Win Rate Explorer, you can look at the stack analysis, you can look at the Stack Explorer, look at those slim formats and see what has worked, is that a lot of the best stacks for maybe that individual week victory and more of a DFS style stack, they aren't going to be the best stacks for a full season best ball. And so one of the things that we want to make sure that we do here is continue to get the values or continue to get our player targets. But within that, if we're not reaching for it, if we're not forcing it, if we do get a quarterback with one of our wide receivers for that week 17 game, then I like to go that route. But again, only if we can really do it without forcing it.
Right. It's kind of interesting talking a little bit with you as we prepared for this. We kind of threw around a couple of players who we said that we were interested in, that maybe where we might have considered taking him didn't quite align with ADP. And, to some degree, some might view that as forcing it. Obviously, that is not the goal, is to not force it, but to otherwise try to capitalize on players that fall within or close to that range to make the stacks work out in hopes of getting that upside, not just in necessarily week 17, but in any given week over the course of the season. We had actually talked about this tool a little bit, and we were sending screenshots of it all day. We have a couple minutes before the draft. We have about 5 minutes. Shawn, for those who maybe aren't familiar with the Stat Explorer, do you want to kind of walk them through what we did looking at this, and then I'll kind of follow your direction with maybe clicking on a couple things to show people what we would be exploring here.
Yeah, so you look here, you can see the QB wide receiver stack, and I believe that you have it up for the Classic. One of the things that we did when we had
I'll switch to FFPC.
Yeah, so we have this slim format that we have information from for just last season. We know that there are going to be some differences between the Classic and the Slim. And one of the things that we found in terms of looking at that in the Roster Construction Explorer is that the Slim probably plays a little bit more similarly to, say, a Best Ball 10, or is maybe in the middle, right? So we want to take the lessons from that in the Roster Construction Explorer and also the lessons from the tight end premium element. So one of the things that we know here is that a wide receiver heavy and tight end heavy approach works. Then we can play around in the Stack Explorer a little bit and look and see what in these best ball formats have worked previously. Now, obviously with the Slim format, we only have last year's numbers, but you can see there that this QB1 with the wide receiver 1 stack has been actually a little bit suboptimal for a full season perspective. That's one of the reasons why, as we're putting our team together today, we're only going to take those if they would be part of our plan otherwise. We're not going to reach for a QB or guarantee that we have a QB with this wide receiver unless it fits. Now, again, the idea here is we want to make it into the playoffs, and then in the playoff portion, that probably will be a little bit more helpful. So we look at that. One of the things also we might want to do is say the QB with the wide receiver 2. That is a less expensive way to play it. One of the things you mentioned, that Mahomes, Hill, Kelsey stack during the season when Mahomes was less expensive. If we could find a move like that where the QB was about to break out, then that's a little bit better than paying the big price for the quarterback. At the same time, these formats here are not late round QB formats. And so we know the longer that we wait at QB, the more we have to spend in terms of roster slots, right? So if we wait, we may have to use 3 spots at QB instead of 2. That takes away from being able to grab one of those late round running backs, which if we end up with a pretty wide receiver heavy construction, then losing one of those spots because we have to take a third QB, that doesn't help us either.
Right. And those are just kind of some of the things that we had talked about, again, off screen, but we're going to hopefully be able to tackle some of these strategies today. I think Shawn and I have a pretty good laid out plan here for this best ball tournament. We're going to get ready to head into it now. We got just about 3 minutes before it starts. Again, this is a FFPC Best Ball Tournament draft. You can find them over at the FFPC. They're $125 entry. The grand prize is $100,000. And when it comes to reaching the playoffs, I believe that you have to win. Is it the top 2 for the regular season to get to the playoffs, or was it top 3? I got to recall real quickly, but you're essentially, once you get to the playoffs, weeks 14, 15, and 16, you have to land in the top 2, I believe, of each of those weeks to advance through the playoffs. And then week 17 is the grand finale of it all, where you can take your shot at winning $100,000. Thanks to everyone for tuning in tonight. Thanks to everyone who helped pump this up on Twitter a little bit. We got some fun names in this draft, and I'm going to pull it up here real quick. Mike Beers, RotoViz alumni, and the man who helped build a lot of the stuff in the best ball win rate tools and explorers. He's actually in the draft. He's actually picking right before us right after us in the first round on the even rounds, and right before us in all the even number rounds. So Mike Beers is in the draft. We got Todd from PA who's in here. I know Todd's been hammering out a lot of these best ball drafts over the last several weeks. So pretty sharp crowd in here. Shawn, is this your first one that you've done for this year?
The first Slim and the first tournament team. I have quite a few FFPC Best Ball Classic drafts, both in the regular and in the Superflex, but this will be the first tournament.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I'm very much looking forward to this. When I saw it come up, I knew I wanted to do one, but I also didn't want to get in too deep over my head. So again, Shawn Siegele from RotoViz here to draft with us tonight. We're going to walk us through a lot of different things here as we get ready to get this draft underway. And then on top of that, I did take some questions on Twitter, just general best ball questions from a few people that Shawn was more than happy to answer with us for a little bit after the draft. So hopefully we can learn a few things and have some fun with this draft. And it is about to get underway. We are picking out of the 104. I don't want to show our hand too much here, even though I don't think it's going to be anything that anyone else is considering doing. But when you're looking at these drafts, Shawn, and you're kind of seeing the draft slots, is there anywhere in particular that you are looking to target based on what round you were picking in? I'm sorry, what pick you were getting in the first round?
Yeah, so we were a little disappointed when the numbers came out here because we really liked those top 3 slots. And then perhaps there were things that we could do a little bit later in the draft. So you see here the 3 players that we really wanted have gone. And now we're in a position where if we follow the strategy that we laid out, we're going to do something fairly unusual. Now, the good part about that is it'll give us a unique build. And I really do think the numbers support this. The bad part is that, we are reaching, we'll be able to get this player later. Sometimes if you're going to play 10 to 15 of these or say 50 of them, then you want to be very careful about taking guys around where they go, because then you can get the most value out of them knowing you can play the other guys from different slots, right? So when you reach, you give up a lot of that value of doing multiple entries. But Zach, I think that we really wanted to do something unique here tonight, something that really fits with both the brand and with our research. And so we're going to go ahead and take Waller at the 104.
Yeah. Darren Waller has been one of my favorite picks. Again, this is my first tournament team on FFPC too. I have drafted a decent amount of FFPC best ball teams that are not tournament. I've also done a few slims. I think tight end and sometimes even tight end are one of my favorite starts, depending on where I am coming out of. Generally, I would be taking Travis Kelce with the first tight end, which obviously we discussed is a little bit abnormal going with Waller here. But I do like the way, let me go ahead and pull up the big board here so we can ready up our queue a little bit. But I do like the way that drafting Waller kind of gives us a shot. Like you said, at that unique build, I don't think that him and Kelce are too far off from one another in terms of the targets and the points that they're providing you in a weekly, in a weekly output. And I think that if there was someone who was to be the dark horse RB1 candidate, maybe this isn't reaching far enough into the terms of dark horse, but I think it would be Darren Waller. And Travis Kelce even went at pick 2. So I like Waller here. I have a lot of belief in his upside. I have a lot of belief in his connection with Derek Carr. I think that they'll be in for a high volume season where Darren Waller will be able to give us a lot of points in this tight end premium format, which again, for those who are listening, is 1.5 PPR instead of just the full point per reception that we're used to seeing across the board in PPR formats. Shawn, what are you thinking right now as this board kind of keeps unfolding? I know right now it's kind of early, so these are going to be your pretty stereotypical picks when it comes to the way that the draft is unfolding right now. But as we look to consider what we're going to be doing with the 209 coming up here, how are you usually approaching a slot like this, given what we tend to see come off the board in the first round and in the early second?
Well, one of the things I discussed in my article this week is that we do continue to see these running backs go off the board very, very early, even though that's not really supported by the research necessarily. Now, if you start running back, and then you wait a really long time for your third running back, that will work. But we really want a one running back start. Now, because we started with Darren Waller, a running back would still be viable for us in round 2. It'll come down to whether or not we like the options who are there. I think this first round has developed exactly as we would expect. It is interesting here to see Ezekiel Elliott jump up ahead of Barkley and Henry, but his opportunity, his situation, very, very good. He's obviously getting plenty of those puff pieces talking about how he's in the best health ever. Often those puff pieces foreshadow the absolute implosion of a player, but I can understand why Elliott would go in this range. Barkley and Henry maybe have some red flags that he doesn't if you like him to bounce back.
Yeah. Zeke is one of those players too. Obviously, like you said, he's got those puff pieces. He's also kind of going everywhere in these drafts. Sometimes you see him go right around these spots, with the 6th overall pick. But I think after you get out of the 103, chaos can tend to ensue, and ADPs don't necessarily hold to what you've seen in the first round if you're just looking at recent ADPs. In this case, Travis Kelce went 2nd. He can usually go around 3rd. And then I think we even kind of made things a little bit goofy with Waller 4th overall. You probably don't see that too often. But if you're willing to take Travis Kelce in the first round, and in particular, if you lose out on a guy like Travis Kelce, going with Darren Waller, if you believe in him, is not a bad pick. We went ahead and made that here. And then you just kind of see where the running backs fall. Definitely Barkley and Henry going after Zeke, I think, is bold, but I don't necessarily think it's a bad move. If Zeke is capable of returning to his past self, which obviously remains to be seen, then I think getting him at 6th overall is more than fine. But it's going to be a question of whether or not that actually happens. Once we watch the season play out. So coming off the board at the 1201, we have Clyde Edwards-Helaire, which I feel like is a little bit early compared to what we've seen him go as. Antonio Gibson, the 1202. Hopkins, the 1203. Anything here that stands out to you as we get ready to come up with our 2nd overall pick here at the 209?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of players we were looking at potentially go with Gibson and Hopkins. They go to the beginning of the 2nd round instead of toward the end of the 2nd round. I like those picks. I think that's where those guys should be going. I think those are smart picks. We no longer have the option of them now. We had a number of players, really 3 players we were debating at this spot. I think one of those guys will make it here, but we do want to be ready to select a player who really falls if that's the way it goes. Some of the people we definitely don't want are still on the board here. So if all of those players are passed on over these next 3 picks, we may have a more interesting selection than we were anticipating.
Yeah, looking back at the conversation we were having earlier, again, I'm showing the draft board here because Shawn is kind of readying up the queue a little bit based on our conversation from earlier. So as things unfold, we may have to consider pivoting here and there on a few picks. Decisions are certainly going to be made a time or two here as we go through this draft. But I think that the ADPs that we're seeing are right. I think sometimes when you look at these ADPs and you see where players are falling, that maybe they are not as accurate as what they should be. And then you get into drafts like this, a lot of strong drafters, and you see things unfold in a way that you think is probably a little bit better and probably a little bit more optimal for the people who are drafting them maybe a little bit earlier than their ADP suggests. Are we looking okay on the queue right now, though, Shawn, or is it too early to panic just yet, or how are we doing?
No, we're still looking good. Ridley has gone here, but we have one player remaining. It'll be interesting to see if Mike takes our guy. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the direction that he does go.
Yeah, well, Mike did actually message me and said, tell Shawn I said hi. So what better way for me to say Mike says hello and then watch him snipe us on our pick here. He took Devontae Adams. I don't think that was where we were looking, so we're okay there. I'm going to pull up the queue so everyone else can see it real quick, Shawn, then we can make our pick. What are we looking at here?
All right, so we have A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf. Brown, I think the player you were arguing for earlier today. I'm a little bit concerned about his situation now with Julio Jones. Is he going to be able to command the necessary targets in an offense that may not be particularly pass heavy? But of the three guys we were really looking at, Hopkins, Brown, and Ridley, A.J. Brown could potentially be the big monster who wins it for us. I think he's a pretty easy pick for us here.
Yeah, I like Brown. I certainly do. Maybe what I'll do is I'll pull up our queue once we're on the backside of draft and we don't see it anymore. But Metcalf is a player that we didn't really get a chance to talk a lot about. But AJ Brown is someone who I do like as far as just the talent that he is on the field. I think that Julio Jones being in Tennessee will open things up for him a little bit. In that offense, obviously the concern with pass volume is going to be there when you're talking about a team like Tennessee, who has not historically been known to pass the ball quite as much as we would like to see with guys like A.J. Brown. But I think with Julio Jones, there could be an uptick in passing offense. And I think that there's a chance that obviously, a little bit more one-on-one coverage, maybe even occasionally, Brown will not draw the number one target or the number one cornerback depending on what Julio Jones is doing. I think AJ Brown could be a highly efficient player once again this year, who we will be more than happy to have on this team. We are getting ready to go into the third round here at the 304. I know we've talked about a couple of different things here. It seems like the only one that really kind of blew up on us here, and it's not that big of a deal. We still got a guy who we like, but was a Calvin Ridley pick. I'm feeling pretty good about coming back around here at the 304. Shawn, where are you at on that? I'm not going to show anything until we are officially on the clock afterwards, just to make sure that we're kind of keeping our cards close to the chest.
Yeah, it would have been interesting to see Harris, Mixon, Chubb, all of those guys go well below ADP. If they had fallen to us at the 403 in a situation where, at the 304 in a situation where we did not yet have a running back, that would have created an interesting dynamic in terms of where do we get that guy. Now Aaron Jones goes off the board. He's really the last of those top players. Zachary, earlier today, you and I did discuss Swift and Dobbins here. What should listeners know in terms of that conversation and where we came down on those guys?
So we talked about a couple things when we were laying out our rankings beforehand. Shawn was a little bit higher on Dobbins. I was a little bit higher on Swift. My concern in particular when it comes to Dobbins is just that historically the Ravens under Lamar Jackson have not been a high volume passing team in terms of getting targets to the running back. I believe it's about 4 targets per game over the last 2 years. And surprisingly, the running back with the most targets per game over the last 2 years has been Ty Montgomery. I believe that was actually 2018, was like 2.8 targets. So simply put, the Ravens star running backs do not tend to receive a lot of targets. Let me go ahead and switch to this pick here real quick. I'm going to show screen, Shawn.
Okay.
All right. So who are we eyeing up here?
Well, after we got into the situation where we couldn't agree, and I think for good reasons, on Dobbins and Swift, decided not to take this running back early in the dead zone. We like both of those guys. If they work out, I don't think that we would be surprised. But we do have a wide receiver we think is going to be an absolute monster. And it fits some of the things that we want to do in terms of winning in the playoff portion. And that is CeeDee Lamb here. With some of the top wide receivers going earlier in this draft than they normally do, I think that Lamb, even though it's a mild reach by ADP, works out pretty well.
Yeah. I love Lamb in this spot. He's a player who I want to get on my teams a lot, and a guy who I often lose on because I think I sometimes play that ADP game a little bit I treat the ADP sometimes as being a little bit too reliant, and then I get afraid to reach on a guy perhaps a couple rounds early or a couple picks early like we're doing here. But in this case, trying to really focus on getting the players that we want. I'm really a big fan of getting Lamb here. Let me go back to the draft board real quick so we can ready up our queue. I'll continue talking on Dobbins. We're going to have a few minutes here between picks, and then we can get back to maybe discussing Lamb a little bit. But my concern with Dobbins and his ADP, which is around late second, early third, was more so just the lack of passing volume that he may see in this year. I know that there's been some talk about the Ravens looking to increase their pass reps to the running back. I think sometimes that's more coach talk than it is something that actually happens. Things are different when the game unfolds. I think Lamar Jackson tends to instinctually be a runner of the football when plays break down, which we know that there's some running backs, that's how they kind of make part of their receiving work for them, is they are able to catch the ball when plays break down. They're near the quarterback and they get the ball in their hands and they move upfield. So I don't really view Dobbins in that light. And then on top of that, we have also seen for several seasons now a split of really not a two running back committee. I know obviously Lamar Jackson is not a running back, but he gets enough rushing volume that you might as well consider him one with the way he eats into the other running backs. And I do have concerns about the volume as well. Shawn's concern was with Swift. I'll let Shawn talk a little bit more about that, but generally speaking, it's the argument, of just kind of the way the coaching system in place now has kind of been talking about him and running back Jamal Williams over these last couple of months now that free agency and the draft is settled. But Shawn, where were you at on Swift? You can give a little bit more of an in-depth take on him.
Well, Swift looked absolutely fantastic in the second half of last season. We know he has that receiving upside. We know how he has that explosive ability where he can break off the big plays. Those are really the two things that we want in a running back. And so to get that kind of player here in the first half of the third round, there are a lot of things to be excited about. I think that the biggest concern, however, is that the Lions have really brought in some other running backs who have some talent as well. And not only have they brought them in, but they've continued to give at least a lot of lip service to the idea that those guys are going to play a lot. One of the things that we're looking for anytime that we spend any kind of high value pick on a running back, because we just want it to be a no-brainer, right? We want the upside to really be through the roof. Is the upside for a team that has Jared Goff at quarterback that really is completely rebuilding on the offensive side, that's not going to score a lot of overall points, is the upside there to use a third round pick on him? I don't necessarily think that it is. I think that Dobbins, even though he has a lower ceiling and doesn't have some of the things that we look for in a running back, I think that he maybe has the opportunity for more blow-up games. So that's one of the things, especially in a best ball and especially in a best ball tournament, I might be more intrigued by. At the same time, I think that our pick of a wide receiver instead, specifically CeeDee Lamb, is still a no-brainer in this format, in this situation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's kind of what we settled on. I know when we were talking out Dobbins and Lamb in particular, I had posed a question to you kind of as like a tiebreaker of looking at, again, we talked about this earlier, the week 17 schedule and perhaps how we could see those play out. And then not only that, but also the offenses and the teams that they play on and the defense and the lack thereof in this case, perhaps in Dallas, where they could be looking to score a lot of points just to maintain pace. I think for me, it kind of came down to, again, we're treating this a little bit as if we're going to be in the championship game. So we're kind of assuming far in advance. But in a Week 17 matchup, Dobbins gets the Rams. I think that could be an interesting game, but maybe not necessarily one where I want Dobbins in. In Week 17, the Cowboys get the Cardinals, and I think that if I'm looking really deep into this crystal ball, it could be an absolute high-scoring affair. It may even be the highest-scoring game on that week. So that's why I felt most comfortable taking Lamb over Dobbins. It kind of came down to not just the team-by-team scenarios, but then also a case of simply the offense that Lamb is playing on and the game that they're playing on in Week 17. How are we looking heading into round 4 here, Shawn? What are we What are we thinking here? I'm not. So what I'm going to do, just full disclosure, so we're on the same page. I don't want to pop up the queue before picks. So I'll pop them up after we make every odd round pick, if that's cool, and then we can kind of show people a little bit about what happened, what's going on here, without giving too much of our hand away.
Yeah. So we see the draft developing, I think, the way that we would have expected. The same basic names coming off of the board here. We're seeing the running backs fall, but not necessarily into a range where they're going to be fantastic values. We see Andrews, Hawkinson, Pitts all coming off the board. The owners in this draft know that you have to have those elite tight ends or those potentially elite tight ends. Hawkinson, a guy who definitely is in the mix to lead the position in targets this season. Mahomes falls a little bit, but again, not to the point where you would call him a fantastic event. I do like the fact that Todd is able to put him here with Hill. He's got one of these builds that is just a lot of fun, right? So that one that we'll continue to track. Cooper comes off the board now. Zach, what are you thinking in terms of our guys? We had 3 or 4 players we talked about here. They're still on the board. They're people who we weren't necessarily going to have to reach for, but might become a little bit tricky if some of the fun guys continue to go off a little bit early. How are you feeling with 3 or 4 picks until our slot?
Right now, I'm feeling pretty good about it. I'm actually going into the draft from here on another screen, so I can also see who we have queued up here without showing it to everyone else here. But based on our conversation, all right, so you have exactly who I thought you would have at the top of the queue here. And I would say that if that's what we want to do, I'm fine with that player. I don't want to talk about him too much just yet, but this is kind of aligning perfectly with what we had previously discussed. And I think that if either of these players honestly hangs around, it's going to be aligning with kind of how we envision and hope that this was going to be unfolding. We'll certainly cover these picks as things happen a little bit, but yeah, no, I'm feeling good, and we'll see what happens here with this pick. We'll see who Beers takes, and then we'll be able to kind of hopefully unveil who we are targeting this round. But I'm feeling fine with it, and then I think that once we get into what would be the 5th round now, I think that's when we'll kind of start to pull things together a little bit more, and we'll see more of our vision start to unfold with this a little bit. So we are coming up on the 409. Mike Beers is on the clock. We're waiting to see who he takes, and then we will be up to pick. We are good to go here. Shawn, let's go ahead and talk about real quick who we're getting ready to target here and why, because I did participate in a mock draft earlier a few weeks ago. I'll cover that in a second, but I'm going to give the floor to you real quick as we make this pick.
Well, it's interesting because a couple of the sort of contingency picks that we had, DJ Moore and Chris Godwin, both of those guys go off the board. And so if Mike had taken our guy here, we would have had to look at a big reach. But we actually did want to get some exposure to a top running back. Travis Etienne is in the dead zone, but keep in mind that the dead zone is more about the profile of running backs who are just wildly overvalued. We don't think that Etienne really fits that mold. He's got the upside we want. This really allows everything else we're going to do tonight to work.
Yeah. Travis Etienne is, he's a first-round draft pick. He's on the Jaguars. There could be a lot of interesting things that begin to happen with that team as things start to shape up over the course of the offseason. Obviously, James Robinson is there. He's probably not going to be quite seeing the snap shares that he saw in 2020, which just made him an amazing league winner, a fun player to track. But Travis Etienne can eat into both the passing game and the running game. I think if Shawn's thoughts align with mine here, the Jaguars are probably a team that is going to be looking at a lot of negative game scripts over the course of the 2021 season. Obviously, they just had the first overall draft pick. I think Etienne is a guy who can contribute to fantasy rosters in a lot of ways, not just on the ground. I think that he can be a tremendous pass catcher for the Jaguars. They were talking about him working at the wide receiver slot. Again, that's probably more camp talk than it is anything that we should get too excited about, but we still obviously envision a world where Travis Etienne would be catching passes. I was doing a mock draft a few weeks ago for NBC Sports with a few people, and at one point in time we hit the draft and things were unfolding. I wish I remember which round it was. I can't recall off the top of my head, but wherever it was, I had actually gone into the RotoViz rankings that kind of helped me take this pick based off redraft, and I saw where RotoViz has Etienne ranked compared to consensus, and I was just like, all right, like if we're gonna believe in Etienne this highly, and the RotoViz rankings are obviously a great source for those looking to draft best ball or redraft or dynasty, anything. RotoViz has it all. ETN, I believe, was he ranked as a running back 10, I think, in the redraft rankings? Does that sound correct?
It may. I haven't looked at what the composite is in the last couple of days, but I know obviously my ranking contributes to that. All of those things that you said, I think, are 100% true. It'll be interesting to see if the Jaguars can have the type of dynamic offense, maybe a Saints minus type of team, but one that creates enough overall value for a couple of running backs to score there. ETN going to be used very similarly to Alvin Kamara. And if you can get that kind of profile at the end of the fourth round, instead of having to pay where we were looking potentially taking him at fourth overall, then maybe we come out a little bit ahead there. The question obviously is that Alvin Kamara is very well proven as being that star level player who can execute all of those things at the NFL level. ETN, despite our confidence in him, still has to show that he can do that. But we do like the profile. I think the upside there, especially in the second half of the season. So one of the things that we know is that based on this kind of construction, your chances of making it to this range that allows you to be in the playoffs is very high. And so then if we do get that performance from a rookie running back in the playoffs, then maybe that gives us a little bit of extra value there. Now we come back around, and this was really the place where we couldn't find a position player or say a running back wide receiver that we really liked. And as a result, we're going to pivot to QB here. I'll let you make this pick. There were two guys we talked about. Our roster build sort of boils down to these two players. Do you want Kyler Murray or Dak Prescott for our first quarterback?
So my first quarterback, I'm kind of leaning Prescott, mainly because I like that we already have Lamb in place. Unless we want to maybe talk about the fact that there are going to be other Cardinals players we could potentially get Murray with later on. But I feel really good about Dak. I feel really good about CeeDee Lamb. I think that we obviously made a little bit of a reach on Lamb to get him. I think that trying to reward ourselves with pairing him with Dak in an offense that may be looking to score anywhere from 25 to 30 points weekly, just to have a chance at winning, is something that can give us a lot of fantasy upside. So I'm a big fan of Dak Prescott here. He, like Lamb, is yet another player who I just have really wanted to get a lot of in drafts, and they don't always fall to me because of how I'm playing the ADP a little bit. I kind of sit around hoping that they come to me. In this case, I think we're believing in what we talked about. We have a plan in place, and we're just going out and getting our guys. So I'm all about getting Dak Prescott here. Shawn, you made the pick. How do you feel about Dak Prescott over Kyler Murray, not just on this build, but even just for the 2021 season?
I have these guys rated very similarly. I have a slight edge for Murray here. I think probably a little bit less has to go right for Murray to hit that really high level. We look at how he played last year, and before the shoulder injury, he still wasn't playing that well, and yet the scoring was just off the charts. It was fantastic. Now, if he takes a little bit of a step forward, and we wouldn't expect someone to take a Josh Allen type of step forward, right? But if he takes a little bit of a step forward and combine that with hopefully more AJ Green, some of the wide receiving value that he's going to have, more guys to really go there and help DeAndre Hopkins out, then I think the upside is just extreme. And so I like Murray there, but within what we're going to do here, and it may even be some things that happen a little bit later, I think Prescott is a very fun pick. It gives us a chance to do some of the things we want to do to win this tournament. And so one of the things that I'd like to do is if I have two players very close together, and I do a lot of drafts with other people, I think co-owning is a lot of fun, having these discussions, being able to do some of the shows, that works out. And so I'm able to sort of diversify my rosters by taking the players that my co-owners like when we're really close like this, to keep from having too much Murray, for example.
Yeah. And this is obviously I've been doing a lot of shows weekly here with different people. Shawn and our preparation was a lot of fun and a little bit different, I think, than anyone else I prepped with. I have not done anything in terms of a spreadsheet. Shawn sending me a spreadsheet. We're out here color coding things, really trying to find ways to visually explain to ourselves and to one another, I guess, just how we plan on approaching this draft. The way we color coded things and broke it down was a lot of fun. Co-managing teams and co-owning teams is a lot of fun to do. And the way we prepare just kind of gives us a sense on these different players, how we view them. And we can see that we're actually fairly close on a lot of guys. And then when we see we're not as close on some guys, we get an opportunity to kind of explain ourselves out and see what we're thinking and see maybe where we want to settle on for a pick. operating a little bit under the assumption that the draft will unfold a certain way where certain players may be available to us. So, again, if you guys haven't done any kind of co-owning or anything like that with each other, certainly it's a fun way to kind of get into a tournament and do some things, or just any team for that matter. It's fun to get in touch with people and build teams this way. I'm looking at the queue right now. Shawn is adding a couple players here who have not completely discussed all of them, but some players who I like. I don't want to give too much away here. But if we take a look at the draft board, which we can certainly talk about as we see things unfold, anything standing out to you as we close out the 5th round right now, Shawn?
It was interesting to see all of those quarterbacks go. You again have a situation where I think these managers are not wanting to get caught where they have to use 3 spots at the QB if they don't have to. Now, you may still want to, depending on how the tail end of the draft falls. If that 3rd QB gives you a lot more safety and adds some upside, whereas you think that the other positions really are more throwaway picks, you might still decide to do that, but you want to have the flexibility there. The other thing is just having these star QBs, again, in a tournament format, gives you some of that upside that you want to have just a huge week in not only week 17, but these other weeks leading up to it. So I'm not surprised by that. I think that makes sense. We have T. Higgins, somebody who I actually think the Higgins would have been an excellent choice early in the 5th round too. His ADP just really makes no sense. So He goes off there right after the QBs. I think that follows completely. And then we're seeing some of these other interesting wide receivers start to come in this range. Dallas goes off the board at tight end there. An interesting and just sort of a tricky pick, but one that could work out in a big way if that passing offense does develop this season, but the young wide receivers are not quite ready to take a step up. He could also end up with a huge number of targets at that tight end position.
I think Goddard is kind of the pass catcher in Philly who I'm feeling most good about, who I'm feeling best about in terms of that offense. I actually am reminded back to my first article that I wrote with RotoViz, which was ironically a year ago today. It was a lot of fun to be on this team for the past year, so I'm really looking forward to year 2. But it was an article that I wrote where I focused on running quarterbacks and the amount of rushing volume that they bring to a team and how that can sometimes negatively impact their pass catchers. And in that article, I actually found that quite often it's the wide receivers who tend to suffer from the running quarterback, depending on how high the volume is for them. Lamar Jackson was kind of the highlight piece there, but there's been a lot of rushing quarterbacks over recent history who have rushed for a high number of attempts per game. If there is a pass catcher who tends to benefit a little bit more from these rushing quarterbacks, it's actually the tight end. So I think Goddard is the one in Philly who I'm really feeling more confident about as a pass catcher compared to others, knowing that Jalen Hurts is going to be likely leading that offense, knowing that he could be looking to rush for, several times a game. I'm sure he'll have a couple-digit rush attempts games in there where the pass catchers, the outside receivers may be limited a little bit. And then, like you said, it's a young core. It could take a little bit of time for them to develop as they get into the season, get things started. Jalen Reagor is not coming off a very solid rookie season, and now they have Devonta Smith looking to get adjusted to the NFL life. So I think Goddard mixed with Jalen Hurts, if the 12th team opted to go that way at some point in time, would not be necessarily bad play. I do like Goddard a lot there. Where are we looking at as we come into the 609, Shawn? We have we have a couple wide receivers here in AJ Brown, CeeDee Lamb. We do have Travis Etienne, and we already have a single elite tight end up there with Darren Waller at the 104. What are we kind of thinking for this next pick? I see where you're leaning, and right now I like it. We don't have to show too much of our hand yet, but how do we – I guess the right question would be, what are we looking to do as far as how we approach this draft in the next couple of rounds now that we kind of have our core solidified?
Well, with Etienne making it to us in round 4, we don't have to be as aggressive at the running back position. We really only wanted to have exposure to one guy there. If Williams had fallen, that would have been an interesting discussion because I think that he offers a lot of the same things that Etienne does, but at a multi-round discount to that same price. The wide receivers here, a lot of our favorite guys are going off in terms of Ayuk, in terms of Deontay Johnson, Noah Fant, someone we were looking at very closely. I think the only concern with Fant there comes down to the fact that the offense may be poor and there's a lot of competition for touches. Unfortunately, the person that we did have all queued up and ready to go there is Logan Thomas. We miss out on him. So who's your backup selection here? We're going to have to reach a little bit at wide receiver. Do you have a preference between Chark and say Juju Smith-Schuster, Jerry Jeudy for this selection?
I know that we talked about this coming up. I don't think we quite talked about in this particular scenario, but I know that we kind of settled, I believe, on Jerry Jeudy as a player who we like based on Denver's schedule for that playoff run in this tournament. And there's not another wide receiver I like on the board. If you're good with Jerry Jeudy, I think we can go ahead and take him. He is a wide receiver who had a lot of air yards last season, not necessarily a lot of receiving yards. The quarterback play in Denver did not help him, but they do have Teddy Bridgewater, who I think is going to see a significant amount of playing time if he's not named the full-time starter right off the bat. Jerry Jeudy is a player who I do like. I know we took him over Courtland Sutton, but I don't necessarily hate that move. I think that Sutton and Jeudy could operate kind of as that team's top two pass catchers, perhaps with Noah Fant and Javonte Williams maybe working a little bit. But I do like Jerry Jeudy a lot. I think he has a lot of talent and is a player who's going to really take that next step forward in year two. Shawn, how do you feel about that pick that we made, knowing that we missed out on someone else who we were originally targeting?
Yeah, I mean, this is hard here because we really wanted Logan Thomas for the build that we have. This is the problem with having people like Mike Beers here. I mean, it would have been a surprise really if he had passed on that selection because it's just a no-brainer at this spot in the draft. He has that potential to emerge as this season's Darren Waller, and to not be able to put those guys together and to be looking at a different path now at tight end, it's pretty unfortunate. We'll see how the next handful of picks develop here. The value at wide receiver is not going to be nearly as good as it would have been if we had been able to get one of those last couple of tight ends. One of the things that we talked about a lot in terms of our preparation for this draft is just that the 104 has a lot of, I mean, you can't complain about getting a higher pick than a lower pick. I mean, that would be silly, right? But it does put you in a position where some of the tight ends, you look at the board that you have up here, Kittle, Hawkinson, Pitts, and then Fant and Thomas going before it gets back into that top third, not being in the position to hit on those tight ends. And people may be thinking, okay, well, you have Waller. If you're going to pick Waller in the first round, then you need to go in a different direction. But the fact of the matter is the tight end is so powerful in this particular format that you want to be overweight at that position. We're no longer able to do that in quite the same way. And that's a pretty big disappointment.
Yeah, losing Thomas was a tough guy to lose. I know that there's a few other tight ends who we had kind of kicked the tires on who I think could make it back to us here. I guess really the question is going to come down to as we get to this next pick. We do have a couple different ways we were looking at going earlier on before I think we kind of talked ourselves out of it, in prep. But early on in the week, we had talked about a couple different guys who we liked here, possibly looking to stack games down the line. Where are you leaning to go with this pick, Shawn? Because seeing who's on the board, I kind of think between our conversations, some of the players who we're eyeing up here. Is there anyone who particularly stands out to you as we look ready to take our 704?
Well, the guy that we had talked about, and again, this is one of the players where we're not really in the right position to take him and get the full value out of it. But we looked at this trio of Bengals wide receivers and like all of them. Boyd, perhaps the least value of the three, but he's going to score a lot of points. And so you look at what he is doing compared to some of the other players who are available here. Chark came off the board, Juju Smith-Schuster, they both came off the board in the interim between our picks. I was hoping that we would be able to kind of wait on Boyd maybe for just a different team. But the way that this draft has developed, then I think that Boyd does a couple of things that we like as we think in terms of some other things that might transpire later.
Yeah. No, I'm with you there. I have no problem with taking Boyd here. I think that he's still a very solid player. The Bengals wide receiver group as a whole, they all saw over 100 targets. Those top three guys did last season between Boyd, Higgins, and A.J. Green. Now with A.J. Green gone, obviously we know that Jamar Chase is going to take a good portion of those targets. But I think that on an offense that's going to, once again, be trailing a lot, looking to kind of play catch up with most of their opponents this season, I think that there's still going to be plenty of a role for Boyd as long as Joe Burrow stays healthy and he works out well for them. Boyd is a player who took a massive hit last year after the Joe Burrow injury. I think all Bengals wide receivers did, but Boyd particularly felt that loss of Burrow, and I think that with Burrow healthy this year, I think he's going to be on the field plenty. I think he could see 100 targets still, and I think that Tyler Boyd is a fine pick here. Where are you at on how this draft is shaping up right now, Shawn? We'll recap it real quick. We're picking out the 104. We have Darren Waller, A.J. Brown, C.D. Lamb, Travis Etienne, Dak Prescott, Jerry Jeudy, and then with the 704, we did go with Tyler Boyd. A lot of things that happened here that we weren't quite expecting, but I think we're looking okay so far. How are you feeling, Shawn? Do you think that this draft has gone completely off the rails, just a little bit off the rails, or are we going to be able to weather the storm through the next couple of picks?
I think the key player for us was ETN in terms of getting back to us in round 4 so we could go with otherwise a very wide receiver heavy draft. Now, if Thomas makes it through, then we're all set. Everything is going exactly as we planned. Because he didn't, not only do we not have him, but we've taken a number of players well above ADP at this point. The thing that we have to keep in mind is we just do want to get our guys. It doesn't make sense to draft someone you have ranked lower just because it's a better ADP value. So if you compare the draft to ADP, we're making some reaches. If you compare the draft to our rankings, then we're actually still getting some very good values on some of those players. It's interesting too, I think, because a lot of these guys are players who are normally going to go with the group that's a little bit later. Now, the fact that Darren Waller also is someone who would go in that later section maybe makes it so we're actually drafting like a 109, 110 team from the 4th slot. But as we continue to move through the draft here and with someone like an A.J. Brown, like an ETN, we have some differences from that. So I think these next couple of rounds are going to really determine the direction that we need to go in the second half of the draft.
Yeah, I'm with you. Like you said, we've kind of gotten some players right now who, as far as our rankings go, I think we're getting a lot of the players who we liked in our rankings, even if we're kind of having to reach on a few of them. But I think kind of at the end of the day, when it comes down to doing some of these picks, you don't want to, we talked earlier, we don't want to reach too far on some of these picks we're getting. But I think that part of winning these drafts sometimes too is drafting with a little bit of conviction in the guys that you like. And if you see that they're somewhere on the board, that they might not make it back to you, you decide that based on your rankings, based on how you're feeling about a player, you kind of go with your gut and see what happens. I don't think that reaching a little bit early on a player who you have ranked high is necessarily a bad pick. I think that it allows you a chance to kind of construct things the way you want to. That's hopefully within a reasonable round of the ADP and seeing what happens with those picks. We did just have Joe Burrow go here at the 7-10. That one is a guy who I know we talked about earlier, Shawn. Not obviously the only quarterback who we needed to get, but how do you feel about Burrow going there at the 7-10? That does feel a little bit earlier than his ADP, which I thought was somewhere in like the 90s. So not too far, but maybe a little bit of a reach there on Burrow. Where are we at as far as those quarterbacks at this point in time?
Yeah, so he's going to the end of round 8. But again, I think this is where his ADP should be. I like him above guys like Stafford, Brady, Aaron Rodgers. And so I think that's a very good selection. Again, we're seeing a lot of the players with ADPs that don't make sense getting drafted closer to where they belong in this particular draft. Not a surprise based on who we have in this particular league.
Yeah. I think that we have a very sharp room here that's doing a lot of different things. There's a lot of players who are, like you said, they're not going quite at their ADPs. Joe Burrow being one of them, who we would have liked to have for that stack, but I think that we'll find other ways to go around it here. We currently only have one running back. That's Travis Etienne. We got our 4 wide receivers kind of settled. We'll look for a few more wide receivers later. When we're talking about roster construction overall, Shawn, which I think is something for those maybe not as familiar with the best ball format as others, this is an 18-round draft, and one thing that definitely matters when constructing these teams is how many at each position that you have. Maybe we'll get into this a little bit more once we get to our 8 or 9 pick, but I'd be curious to hear how we should kind of go about building a team based on the number of quarterbacks you should have, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, depending on how we're building our team. We're going with the early tight end here. We probably don't need to spend as much early draft capital to get a second tight end, things like that. But a little bit of roster construction, I think, is kind of worth talking about here in this format in particular, where I think it will matter so much more in a room that's this sharp playing in a tournament like this. But before we get to that, where are we wanting to go here with this next pick? There's a lot of guys now who have kind of reached our later round ranges who we're liking. We're about halfway through this draft right now. Is there anyone that's standing out to you in particular, or any position that's standing out to you in particular, given the current construction of our team?
Well, we know that one of the reasons we felt very comfortable taking this wide receiver heavy approach is that we had a lot of running backs that we like in the double-digit rounds. And so continuing to load up at wide receiver, potentially taking a tight end, having two good quarterbacks if it works out that way. You talked a lot about the roster construction, and one thing that we do see is that if you can limit your picks from QB and tight end to 5, then you have a little bit more room to build up your depth at the wide receiver, at the running back position. So that's something where if you take the players earlier, then it helps you save the roster spots, but then obviously you miss out on the guys you might have otherwise drafted. So I think that that's where we're getting to in this particular league, is trying to make some of those distinctions. Fortunately or unfortunately, some of the wide receivers we wanted, like a Laviska Shenault, goes a few spots ahead of where we would have been able to get him. I think that he would have been another interesting pick in round 7, but of course, based on his ADP, we tried to take the risk to see if he would get a little bit later.
Yeah, and this is just a draft where ADP has kind of been thrown out the window a little bit here. Things are getting pretty unique in terms of the builds. We just lost Shenault. We're getting ready to pick after Mike Beers again right here. We'll see who he takes. Last time we were in this situation, he got Logan Thomas on us. We'll see who Mike Beers takes here, and then we'll get ready to make our next pick at the 809 as we prepare for the back half of this draft. But I am with you, Shawn, in terms of just building best ball teams in general. I kind of tend to keep the teams with the like these 18, 20 round picks, usually around 2 to 3 tight ends and 2 to 3 quarterbacks with our builds. Right now, we are on the clock. The player who we have at the top of our queue is still available, and we talked about him earlier. I'm fine with taking him here. Shawn, do you want to tell everyone who we're looking at, and maybe if that's who we're in fact going to go with?
Yeah, so we have Gesicki and then a handful of running backs in this spot. The downside, of course, you get knocked out in week 14 if you make it to that point. The upside is you have this ultra-athletic tight end ready to break out. Could be that guy who a year from now is drafted much, much earlier. Also a situation with losing out on Logan Thomas. We probably have to press to make sure that we get that second tight end with some upside. So I think it makes sense to go in that direction with this pick.
Yeah, I'm fine with Mike Gesicki here. I think that one of the things that has really just been kind of a lot of fun for me as I get myself more familiar with the FFPC format in particular is being mindful of the tight end premium scoring that we get in this league. I think that it's kind of fun to know that some of the elite tight ends, some of those big playmakers who we see make play on Sundays are a little bit more distinguished in FFPC leagues, can give you a little bit more upside for the targets that they're seeing, for the receptions that they're bringing in compared to your standard PPR league. Mike Gesicki, like Shawn said, super athletic player, a guy who I think is going to see a lot of targets from Tua this year. So I think that Gesicki in this round is a perfect pick. I think that he's a fine tight end too. And he's kind of being taken at a spot here where we don't necessarily need him to be a top tight end for us every week, but we'll probably benefit from him having big weeks when they do happen, realizing that Darren Waller is most likely going to be our tight end 1, assuming that he's healthy and seeing his normal dose of volume. But we are about to get into round 9 here. Some things have not quite gone as planned, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going wrong. We're just kind of zigging where other people are zagging. We're pivoting and making moves along the way. With this pick here, as we get ready to go into the 904, Shawn, like you said, we have some running backs queued up here. We currently only have one running back. Where are you looking at in terms of how this build's shaping up right now? We touched on roster construction. When would you consider maybe going with something like more running backs compared to wide receivers, or more wide receivers compared to more running backs based on our builds? We'll make this pick first, and then we can cover that if you want to. But
this is the area where we start to make some of those decisions. And like we said, we like a lot of the guys in the double-digit round. So if we were to continue passing, I think that would be absolutely fine. At the same time, one of the reasons, again, that we did it this way is that wide receiver really deadens at this point. So if you don't have your wide receivers yet, you're not going to get them. And we can see that a lot of teams have taken that approach in this particular league. A lot of teams only have 2 running backs to this point. So we're not going to be the only team trying to add on running backs at this spot. We had talked about a trio of running backs here. which one would you like to go with now that all three of them are available for us?
Yeah, so now all three of them are available to us. Are they close enough in ADP where we could probably talk about them? I guess they probably are. But the one who we have at the top of the queue, I won't give everyone away, but the one who have at the top of the queue who I do like is Tony Pollard. I think my only concern, real quick, and I'll just throw it out here and I'll let you say something before we get him. My only concern with Pollard might be that he doesn't quite see the volume that we want to have out of a running back at this range, in which case I'd be fine with going with Zach Moss if we think he may be a little bit better of a pick here. Before we pick Shawn, are you more convicted on Pollard or Moss here?
Well, Connor was the person that you wanted pre-draft. Are you off of him for this selection?
I think when I wanted him, I was kind of more of the mindset that we would be having Hopkins and Kyler Murray possibly with that, or at least Hopkins. But right now, I think that based on the way that things are falling, I think that having that third Dallas player is good enough if we believe in Pollard's opportunities with Dallas. And I think that was kind of what my concern was with him. But are you fine with Pollard there? Now that we have him, I guess we kind of have to be.
Yeah, no. Pollard is a big-time pick. He was a key part of the team that Curtis and I had that finished 12th in last year's FFPC main event. And talking about upside, we saw that, I think, in week 15 last year, where we put up the huge game, pulled our team that had Diggs and Kamara and some of those players, was a little bit of a separator from the rest of the pack, being able to throw that big game in for him. Now, if Elliott stays healthy, then you are going to still get some standalone value, not the value you necessarily are looking for, but to add a guy in here who's going to have some receiving value, is going to be in this explosive offense. And we're never rooting for anyone to get hurt, but if something should happen to Elliott, if he goes out and he's out completely, or if he even just has a little bit more of that decline that we saw last season. So the question for Elliott is how much of the decline, and there was a pretty significant decline, how much of it was injuries, how much of it was the quarterback play, and how much of it is just him getting closer to that Todd Gurley, David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell type of level. If we see that from him, we could see Pollard take a lot of touches away in 2021.
Yeah, I certainly think that that's the case. I guess my concern with Pollard has always come down to just those touches, because we've seen him now in the Dallas Cowboys offense. For this will be, I believe, it's year 3. First 2 years, he has really not quite gotten the volume I think that we want. I feel like we've been drafting Tony Pollard kind of in the middle of drafts for the last couple of years, hoping that maybe he'd see the volume that we think a talented player like him should get. But in this particular case, I know we talked about James Conner earlier. I think the Conner idea I was more into with the thought that maybe we would have had either Kyler or Hopkins to get pieces of that Arizona offense. But having the opportunity to have Pollard with Dak and CeeDee Lamb, I think is kind of a nice little trio of players to have. We certainly don't want to become too overexposed to Dallas. That's not going to help us out if there's ever some down weeks. But I think that Pollard is the kind of guy who will benefit from catching passes from Dak Prescott and hopefully making some plays through the air along with on the ground. And like you said, if at any point in time Zeke either goes down or is just not quite living up to the elite running back status that he's carried for the last several years, I think that Pollard becomes more involved and he just becomes more of a value with that 9th round pick. Right now, we are about to go into the end of the 9th round. We are currently looking at a roster that has Darren Waller, A.J. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Travis Etienne, Dak Prescott, Jerry Jeudy, Tyler Boyd, Mike Gesicki, and then Tony Pollard made with our most recent pick. Shawn, I think that one thing that is kind of interesting to watch happen here right now is I think to some degree earlier on we had kind of talked about and possibly expected that we might have had our second quarterback by now, but quarterbacks have kind of gone early. Where are you at on the quarterback position right now, given where we're at through the first 9 rounds as we enter into round 10?
Well, because we have Prescott, we have a ton of flexibility here. We can go with the 2, let's say, borderline elite quarterbacks. We can go with Dak and only one other guy and get that player late. We can go with Dak and 2 late quarterbacks. And so because of that, I think that we don't have to force anything. Now, we have a couple guys that we like later to have lost out on this stretch that included Hurts, Stafford, Rodgers, Brady right before we picked in round 9, and then Tannehill in the middle of round 9 here. We're going to have some interesting options coming back through. We had talked about getting Burrow, but of course he didn't make it anywhere close to back to our pick in round 8, and that's okay. we have a lot of different options there. I think with Gesicki being the person we really had targeted, that we probably would have gone that direction anyway. We knew we wanted to get one of the trio of Pollard, Moss, or Connor there in round 9. So this sets up very nicely for us as we come back in round 10. What are your thoughts on the different possibilities, both construction-wise and player-wise, as we look at round 10 here?
I think right now, with looking at this round, obviously we only have 2 running backs, but I think with the way we're viewing ETN, we kind of feel confident that in his value and where we got him, that I think we're, based on the way we're kind of drafting, I think we're kind of treating him as if he's almost a player who we think is going to outplay his ADP and be much better than the spot where we took him at. And that's kind of resulted in us still feeling confident and going with a number of wide receivers and even a second tight end before getting our running back too. When it comes to the overall construction of this particular roster, Dak Prescott, like you said, he has us feeling really good because of the expectation that he's going to just consistently week in and week out be that quarterback one that we're looking for. I think now when it comes to the construction and being mindful of things, it's where we need to start looking running back just maybe a little bit more, maybe finding a guy who we think could have some involvement in his team's offense on hopefully a weekly basis. One thing that I've kind of tried to focus on this year compared to some years before is where once upon a time, I'd be more prone to kind of trying to hold those traditional handcuff players who I just thought were like the elite players who you could stash and stash and stash. And then, if something ever happened, if an injury or whatever happened, which we obviously don't cheer for, but they do happen, then that handcuff all of a sudden becomes a top tier player on the offense. Having gotten into best ball a little bit more, now when I'm looking to target running backs, I'm trying to target guys who I think I can convince myself are going to be maybe more involved with the offense than the traditional handcuff. A traditional handcuff who I would consider that being like right now as a player who we're pretty low on, so I don't think that it's any problem me saying so, but as Alexander Madison, who I just don't see having a role independent of Dalvin Cook when he is healthy. So now with the roster construction, our 4 wide receivers set, 2 very good tight ends and an elite quarterback. Running back is where I'm kind of leaning more towards here, but still wanting to also perhaps consider maybe a 3rd tight end before tight end becomes just a little bit too much of a wasteland for us. As we ready up the queue here, we're going to be on the clock in just a second. Where are you leaning with this pick, Shawn, as we get ready to make a selection, again, with roster construction in mind and how we've kind of gone so far?
Yeah, definitely. This is a good spot to look running back. One of the players we were hoping would come back through was A.J. Dillon. He went off the board really toward the end of the previous round. And so now we're looking at some guys like a Henderson, and he's the person that we had loaded up to go at this spot in our pre-draft meetings. Is that the direction you'd like to go here?
Yeah, I'm absolutely fine with that. I think we're ready to go with Darrell Henderson here. I think that he kind of fits what I just described earlier as a running back who will hopefully still have some involvement in the offense, even with obviously Cam Akers being the RB1 there. One interesting note on Darrell Henderson last season was, if I remember correctly, I believe he actually led the Rams running backs and receptions last season. Cam Akers was hurt for part of this season, but there was times in the year where Darrell Henderson still saw receiving work over Akers. And I think that, as is the case with most running back situations, some kind of form of a running back by committee tends to exist. And I think that Darrell Henderson could have a role as a pass catcher in this offense. And it's an offense that I think should still be very good. It's an offense that features Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, Cam Akers, again, we touched on him. But then also I think the big one is Matthew Stafford, who is going to hopefully be able to do a little bit more in terms of moving the ball downfield in hopefully a more efficient manner for the Rams in 2021. We are still currently sitting on 1 quarterback right now, but feeling fine with Dak Prescott. We just got ourselves our 3rd running back. We have 2 tight ends and 4 wide receivers. I think this is kind of the part where you start to see certain areas of your draft where maybe you are solidifying certain positions. If you do something like a 2nd quarterback or a 3rd tight end here, we don't necessarily have to go with either of those positions here, but we also want to be mindful of what it may look like with a less than stellar quarterback 2 or tight end 3 with the build we're kind of targeting here. So Shawn, walk us through what we're leaning towards with the 1104 here. as we're about to be on the clock again with a few players sitting in our queue.
Yeah, so one of the players that you liked pre-draft was Mike Williams. We could go here and get a wide receiver to match up with Justin Herbert, have that vertical upside there. We could go with one of the running backs, even though the running backs that we had in this range have already been selected. We could also go with one of the quarterbacks. There are a trio of guys who are pretty interesting at this point. Which player is your preference for really augmenting the guys that we currently have?
So I think the question that we need to ask too is if we opt to go with the quarterback, the guy we have queued up, their bye weeks match up with the one we currently have. But then I do also like the idea of possibly going wide receiver here. I don't think that any of the tight ends who we have queued up we necessarily need to get with our top two. I'm kind of fine with either pick here. I guess my question to you real quick would be, if we get a third quarterback here, or if we get a quarterback here and who we have queued up, we're obviously going to need to go with the 3 quarterback build over a 2. Are you fine with who we have in the queue and going with the 3 quarterback build?
I am. I think that is something that probably makes sense at this point. So let's go ahead and get a fun one here and go with the rookie.
Okay. So I'm fine with that. I think that Trevor Lawrence is going to be a fun player to have this year. We just got him with Travis Etienne. Again, I pointed out that we now have quarterbacks, both at the same bye week, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. You can still go with a 3 quarterback build. That's absolutely fine. Teams can survive that way. What is it that we kind of like about Trevor Lawrence here at this particular spot? We even took him over someone like Matt Ryan. Justin Fields is still on the board, who a lot of people like. Sometimes you may see him go higher than Lawrence. He didn't in this case. But what are some things that we like about Trevor Lawrence in this particular build, getting him with ETN, but then also, just how we could envision his 2021 season unfolding?
We think about what we saw from Burrow last season, where he had to put the entire offense on his shoulders, really move the ball, and he did that. Now, these are 2 different guys. We talk about them as being 2 of the best prospects in the last 10 years. A lot of people like Lawrence as a generational type of player. I think that with the potential for that Jacksonville offense to, number 1, need to score a lot of points, number 2, to actually do that and come through. And then you look at the rhetoric surrounding some of those players, where you mentioned ETN. He has DJ Chark, who's had a big season in the past. He has Laviska Shenault, who really appears to be kind of roaring up in terms of the way people are looking at him, his performance in OTAs. They could end up going from one of the weaker wide receiver depth charts to one of the better wide receiver depth charts almost overnight. And then you have this dynamic offense with the young quarterback really pushing to score the points. So perhaps we're a little bit overly enthusiastic based on what Herbert and what Burrow did last year. But at this point, with this value, I really like having a guy who's going to need to score a lot of points to keep his team in it.
Yeah. I think the reason that we like I think the reason that we like Lawrence is for all the reasons that we kind of talked about off screen with Burrow. What was essentially one and the same is what you just laid out. An offense that's going to need to keep pace with a lot of opponents, an offense that's probably going to be throwing a lot. I am completely in on the Trevor Lawrence pick. I think he's probably one of my highest drafted quarterbacks in some other best ball leagues. He's the guy that I'm absolutely fine with taking. And I think that in terms of looking to stack him, if you wanted to, there are a multiple number of ways we could even look to stack him with players outside of just ETN. I will say it's probably not going to be Tim Tebow, though. I don't think that Tim Tebow is going to be who we're going to be chasing here as a third tight end option. Although anything could happen, as we've seen in this draft. There's been a number of things that have kind of happened that are a little bit unexpected in terms of ADP that have forced us to reevaluate on the fly and kind of change up our thinking on some guys. But overall, I like the way this team is shaping up. Shawn, with the way that this team is looking, now that we have our 2 quarterbacks solidified, I asked you earlier before we went with Trevor Lawrence in the 3 quarterback build. The 3 quarterback build was not something we originally planned on doing. Does this change how we're going to approach going with quarterback and tight end, which we talked about kind of wanting that number to total perhaps 5 when doing the build? Is going 3 quarterbacks going to change how we may consider tackling tight end, or would you look to pivot on another position with the hopes of still kind of getting a solid third tight end in addition to the quarterback that we now have to get.
I think that the key element here for us is just going to be to take the best values that we get as they relate to the running backs. So if the running backs that we have allow for a tight end to sneak in there, I still feel comfortable with that. We want to get all that tight end firepower out there. At the same time, these running backs now into this range are the ones we were really excited about. We want to make sure that we get them. And I should mention that on the Mike Williams, he was actually drafted much earlier, so I had missed that selection there. Another guy who is an interesting wide receiver pick at that range, but you look at what he has done in some of the past seasons, and his 2020 could be a little bit of an aberration. So as we get about 5 picks away, there's perhaps a tight end that we like here, and then there are a lot of running backs. Without giving away who that tight end is, what direction are you leaning at position as we go into this round?
Yeah, so I had to. I apologize. I'm managing a couple different things here, but I had to pull up our rankings real quick, and I see that who you have up there, which I'm absolutely fine with this tight end if we do opt to go this route here, which, haha, he just went. So we won't be doing that now, but there's another tight end who he had also debated going with as well, that we have queued up. So I don't mind that pick either. I think at this point in time, when it comes to getting the tight end 3, what you're really just chasing is that upside at the position, hoping to either find that guy in a good offense or that guy who maybe is just being undervalued because of changing circumstances with teams, or just a little bit of uncertainty at the position within his own team. So some of the guys who we do have up who we like, I'm absolutely fine with taking. I think we could perhaps go that route now if he's still on the board and he comes back to us. I also don't hate running back. I think that one thing that was a lot of fun when kind of setting this draft up in particular was you and I did have a lot of agreements on running back. So I kind of expect that when we decide to start hammering out the running back position here, it's just going to be a lot of nodding and agreeing and kind of going with the guys who we all agreed on our spreadsheet earlier when talking this thing out. Would you be looking to, based on how the board is unfolding here over these next couple of picks, are you fine with who we have currently sitting at the top of the queue, or would you prefer to lean running back here?
Yeah, so we should go with a running back unless the last sort of big wide receiver target that we have, we're worried that he too will be reached for ahead of ADP. That might be a direction to go. The question I would have for you here, we have all of those running backs that we had talked about that we had agreed upon. Mm-hmm. Zach Moss was one of the guys that we liked earlier. Devin Singletary, perhaps still in a little bit stronger role, one for more volume, probably not the high value touches that Moss has, probably not the upside either of being the big breakout player. Between Singletary and some of the other guys, do you have a preference for this pick?
If we're talking about the running backs who we have sitting in the queue right now, I would probably say that Singletary is who I'd prefer to go with over these picks right now. Another guy who we had talked about, which I think could be an interesting player as well if he's still on the board. He just went, actually. I was going to say J.D. McKissick, but he just went. I'm absolutely fine with going with Devin Singletary here, making this our pick. And then I think we can talk about tight end possibly on the next round when it comes right back to us. Or even wide receiver, actually, now that I'm looking at it. So I'm fine with going with Singletary here. I think we just got Rashad Penny. So
he was the player that you had liked and were looking at. I made the last second switch because we had a little bit of waiting to that week 7 bye, just trying to balance that out. Singletary may come back through, so still some possibility there. Penny was someone you really liked, was part of your draft plan for us in this league. Tell us why we should have Penny on our teams.
So the reason I didn't mention him, I didn't see him in the queue, so I thought maybe our pre-discussion about the knee cleanup was why we hadn't put him in the queue. We had kind of decided that maybe we wouldn't go that route. But no, I do like Rashad Penny. I think that when it comes to him being in Seattle's offense, looking to establish the run as Pete Carroll and everyone in Seattle seems to want to do, I think with Penny, we're kind of banking on upside, assuming health, and which is, again, that's why I hadn't mentioned him earlier, because I know that our last conversation on him was kind of questioning about his knee. But if we feel good enough about his knee and the fact that he's going to be healthy, he's cleaned up and good to go, then I think Penny right now are just betting on upside in terms of a talent perspective and where he was drafted coming out of college. He's looked okay in some of the games that he was healthy in, and in an offense that's always talking about wanting to run the ball. I think that Penny is more than a fine player to have, again, assuming health in the Seattle offense. So I like Penny here. I'm actually glad that we went with him over Singletary. That would have been my first bet, actually. Just looking again back on that conversation, I was like, did we officially go off of him? But no, I like the Penny pick a lot here. I'm looking and seeing here right now that we have a couple of other players who are non-tight ends on the board still that we had talked about getting earlier. I don't think we necessarily need to go tight end here, Shawn. Where are you leaning towards with this pick?
Well, we have a lot of running backs who are still green for both of us, so still priority targets for both players. We really only have one wide receiver who fits that mold for the next 3-4 rounds. He might come back around to us, but the way wide receivers have been drafted in this draft, I'm afraid that he would not. So I would be looking forward to taking more at this position here and not risking it.
Yep, and that's exactly what I was going to say. So I'm absolutely fine with Rondale Moore there. I think we're lockstep in that. I think that Rondale Moore is a fun player to have on this team. Just excellent talent. I think the concern with him is a little bit of his size, but I think that in the Arizona offense, I think there's going to be a lot of ways that the Cardinals are going to find a way to get more of the ball. Where are you at on Moore as a prospect? That's something that I've admitted to other people here on the show, that rookie knowledge is not necessarily one of my stronger points, that I still need to get a little bit more into dynasty. So I always like to kind of get the opinions of people in terms of rookies on these teams and that we're drafting, seeing where they're at on them. Where are you at on Moore as a prospect? Where are you at on Moore as a receiver for the Arizona Cardinals in 2021?
Well, he's one of those guys that has a tricky profile because it points in a couple different directions. We have this amazing breakout season for him as an 18-year-old, and then a lot of injuries, opt-out, that kind of thing since then. He's in this offense here. We'll get to play off of DeAndre Hopkins. He'll have Kyler Murray again, hopefully taking that next step. He was somebody we were looking at for this Arizona-Dallas game, and if it's a shootout, where the Cardinals are forced off of Hopkins for whatever reason, defenses will be trying to take him away. The Cardinals have talked a lot about Moore as a manufactured touch guy. I'd like to think that's not going to be all that he is for them, but he's going to be one of those players who is so dynamic after the catch. If you're going into the season, you're getting one of these top rookies. We look at what some of the rookies did last year. We know that rookie contributions are accelerating, right? So the last 3-4 years, we're just getting so many more points from rookies. I think in this particular offense, to have Moore as the guy, I mean, he could be that guy we're talking about 6 months from now as being the true breakout wide receiver from 2021 or the rookie sensation. Now, there'll be a lot of guys to compete with in this class. We have some players like Chase and Smith, and then Elijah Moore. The numbers for him, if you check out Blair Andrews and the Wrong Read, he's got a couple of great pieces on these young guys. Both Elijah and Rondale Moore hit a lot of the metrics that we look for, and I think those guys are going to make a rookie year contribution.
Yeah, and what you just said kind of just outlines what I hear a lot of, what I read a lot of on Twitter, obviously some of the stuff on RotoViz about these talents and the multiple ways that Rondale Moore can contribute. You talked about manufactured touches. Some people do talk about him as a guy who I think it's more jokingly than it is serious, as being a guy who could potentially get running back touches. But I think that even within that joke still lies some truth, a little bit of, just how they envision him being utilized within his team and how they think that the Cardinals could deploy him, given his skill set, his abilities, like you said, as an early breakout, as just as a elite athlete who's capable of breaking a game open in many different ways for an offense that has otherwise, been pretty exciting. I think that when it comes to the Cardinals, I think we tend to be a little bit disappointed with some of the surrounding players that aren't named Kyler Murray, that aren't named DeAndre Hopkins. Christian Kirk hasn't quite been what we hoped he would be. Larry Fitzgerald has always kind of hung around. I think that perhaps this year, with some new pieces involved, with Rondale Moore added to the roster and another year to work with Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins, I really think that this year could be the year that the Cardinals perhaps take a step forward with the new players that they've surrounded Kyler Murray with. And I even kind of like Chase Edmonds a little bit, working in hopefully what's going to be a lead running back role now that Kenyon Drake has departed. We are currently in line to be taking our pick at 1409 right now. We've got a couple guys who we have sitting in the queue. We also are going to be looking for a third quarterback at some point in time. Shawn, where are you leaning with this pick? Do you think that we're in a position where we need to reach for any players? Do you think that we're in a position where we can kind of continue to play what the board is giving us right now? How are you feeling about this current setup as it sits right now?
Well, one of the things that we have going for us is that we have 3 late QBs that we like a lot. So we don't have to have any type of panic as we look to those players. And then Singletary, for example, continues to fall here. We have some perhaps more exciting names who are also still on the board. We're going to have a lot of options with this round 14 pick.
Yeah, we are. I know that one player who I think we'd probably still be a little bit early on him right now. He's sitting at the top of our queue. I don't think we need to exactly take him just yet. But I do like who we have sitting at the top of the queue here. One guy, who is coming back to us. We already avoided him one time. It's not really a secret that we want him at this point in time since we had already talked about him, was Devin Singletary. Are we out on Singletary still because of the bye weeks and trying to mix things in a little bit better? We currently have 2 running backs on week 7 buys out of the 4 that we have, and Singletary would also fall in line with that week 7 buy as well.
No, I don't think that we're out on him, but we do have a couple other players that we like similarly, players we knew we were going to be able to get later and might want to go ahead and take that, even though, by ADP, they're not the same kind of value. We also have a QB here that we have been looking at that might be a value. He goes off the board. I think it would have been interesting to select him if he had lasted another spot. So with down to the 2 quarterbacks here, do you want to take the plunge with one of them, or do you want to keep waiting?
So I'm fine with going quarterback here, but I also really do like one of the running backs here who I'll just hold off saying here until Beers makes his pick. But there's one running back here who I think I'm fine with above the others, and then there's also a quarterback here who I really like as well. I don't think he's actually tuning in because he told me he wasn't going to be able to stream. So we'll find out here. I'll just go ahead and say it. But the guys who I like, I am a fan of Derek Carr in this spot. I think that he would be a nice player to pair with Darren Waller. If we wanted to get other Raiders later on, we can do that. And then I don't have a problem with Singletary, but I think that I would probably be a little bit higher on Phillip Lindsay at this point. He's a player who I've had a lot of, who I've been interested in drafting, all off season. I think that the reason that the Texans brought him in was, in fact, to probably play more snaps than some people are anticipating and than what his ADP suggests. I think personally that Lindsay's ADP is way off. I'd be curious as to your thoughts with that. But of the 2 players who I just mentioned, do you prefer one over the other? Do you prefer someone else entirely? What are you thinking here?
Well, Phillip Lindsay has always been my guy. I couldn't believe what happened to him the last season in Denver. I think that he's going to have, I don't know, a big season. I don't think we can say that about anybody who plays for Houston, but I like his chances to be the guy for whatever that's worth. Let me throw this back to you. I want you to make this pick. Do you want Carr? Do you like Lindsay? We've obviously talked about Lindsay. He could get picked in the interim, but we do have some other running backs we like as well.
Yeah, so looking ahead, we got 24 seconds to make this pick. We have a couple teams ahead of us who also only have 2 quarterbacks, and the 101 has 1 quarterback. I'd probably prefer to go Carr here just because I'm not sure if I want to be stuck with some of these other quarterbacks we have sitting here. I think Carr would be it for me if you're good with that pick.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Yeah, I was sitting there and I was looking at that 101. They only have Josh Allen, and I think that there's, at least in my mind, a pretty big break in quarterbacks here. I don't mind Daniel Jones. I think Zach Wilson is nice from the perspective that he's probably going to play a full season, but I think that Derek Carr just gives me a little bit more confidence in terms of his ADP, where he's going at, and I think that he's still probably going to be the guy in Vegas for the Raiders in 2021. I don't think that anything with Marcus Mariota being on that roster is going to threaten Carr's starting role. And like you said, we have a lot of running backs here who we still like. Let me scroll down through our rankings as we work our way through this draft, because we're going to be getting to the 15th round here. I mean, there's green popping up all over the board here. Even if we did lose Lindsay, there's plenty of other players who I like. We got our 3 quarterbacks, and as far as some of the other positions go that we talked about, I think we still have some players who we like. overall. I think the star of this draft has gotten off a little bit different than what we expected, but I think that right now, the way things are looking, I think things have kind of started to maybe come back a little bit closer to us in how we expected things to unfold. Would that be correct in that statement, Shawn, or are you thinking things are still getting a little nutty here with some of these picks?
I like how this draft has gone. It's gone much more like what from the elite group that we're drafting against. It's been fun to have to play off of that. And at the same time, the build that we wanted to do, we've been able to put together, and the players we wanted, we've been mostly able to get. As you mentioned, we have a couple of guys here. I think that Daniel Jones would have also been an interesting pick for us. He didn't make it around. He almost certainly wasn't going to make it around. We would have had to pick him if we wanted him in the last round. Madison Parkhill's got a great article up on the site about Jones and why he could be sort of the Josh Allen for this season. So I think that he actually has more upside than Carr, who we went with. And the upside is interesting, obviously, in a tournament format like this. But Carr is someone who is an undervalued player. I like the safety that gives us. You like that pairing with Waller for that week 14, 15, 16, 17 time period, where if they break out together or have that big game together, then it helps you move along. The thing that has happened here, Lindsey's come back around. We do have a couple of other running backs, but I think that he's probably the guy for us.
Yeah, I think if we were debating taking him last round, I think that we'll take it as a sign of good fortune. I'm fine with taking Philip Lindsay here. Yeah, I like Lindsay's pick. Where are you at in particular? Because I think that the Houston Texans in general, just for all the disaster that they kind of appear to be, I think that sometimes within teams that appear to be disasters, there also tends to be kind of interesting conversation to be had on these players. David Johnson, I don't have his ADP right in front of me, but I know that it's a good bit higher than Philip Lindsay's. I'll pull it up here real quickly just so we can talk about it. David Johnson has an ADP of about 113.5, Lindsay at 168.9. Do you think that these ADPs, they're obviously far off? Do you think that they are far off and that it's correct, or are you just much more in on Lindsay than consensus, I would say, at this point in time? Because personally, that's where it is for me.
I like the guys who have the explosive ability. I think that there is a potential that we'll see what we unfortunately saw with David Johnson with the Cardinals, where Kenyon Drake, you watch the two of them together on the field in that season. Drake was so much more explosive that they had to really make the move to him even once David Johnson came back. Now, the thing that you do have here with Johnson is that for a big back and for a back who probably will get some goal line touches if the Texans are ever down in the red zone, is someone who also is a good receiver, right? He's a better receiver than he is a runner at this point. And so when you talk about high value touches, I think that's where he has the real edge. And that's something from a fantasy perspective that we want to be very aware of. At the same time, one of the things that we see with Johnson and with Lindsay that we've written a lot about on the site, Charles wrote about a lot in the old days, Jack Miller has written about recently, is this idea between the big gap running backs and the small gap running backs and win rates. And one of the things that you see is with these running backs who are drafted somewhat closely together, that the second of the two players has a much, much higher win rate sort of overall. That doesn't mean in any particular situation that's what you're going to get. Obviously, you have a situation with ETN and Robinson where we liked the more expensive player that time. But Lindsey's someone, I think there are a lot of different traits that work to his advantage, especially when you're talking about someone being drafted in round 15.
Yeah, at this point in time, I think some of the players who are getting in these rounds, the fantasy industry kind of casually likes to throw around the word free when it comes to these players who we're acquiring. What we essentially mean with that is players who are not hopefully going to hurt your team as much as they will boost your team in weeks where they are good. Right now, if you're looking at our roster, we have Travis Etienne, we have Tony Pollard, we have Darrell Henderson, we have Rashad Penny. I can see scenarios where Rashad Penny, Henderson, and Pollard all kind of sprinkle in, their weeks that are making them worth their picks, and then we're kind of being anchored down by Travis Etienne with that fourth overall, with our fourth pick. Our fourth pick, our first running back off the board, where now we're looking to get guys in the 15th, 16th round. And at this point in time, what we're trying to buy is upside. And I think that Philip Lindsay has that. I think that if anything happens to David Johnson, I think Philip Lindsay is the de facto running back one for Houston. I know the offense is gross. I know we don't necessarily love it, but at some point in time, things are going to happen where someone's going to have to play, and make plays for this team, regardless of what we think of it. they're going to have to field an offense. They're going to have to go out there and try to make plays and win games. I think Lindsey has shown himself more than capable of being able to work in both the running game, and I know that he's not necessarily the best pass catcher. He doesn't tend to be viewed as one of the most efficient ones, but in a PPR league, I'll take the receptions and hope that he's able to break a few big plays. So I like Philip Lindsay here. I think if anything, I was most disappointed by his kind of choice of landing spot. When I saw him go to Houston, I was like, you can't tell me that the best actual spot that he could have gone to was the Houston Texans. Knowing how gross we find that offense, I would have liked to see a better landing spot, but I also have no problem with taking him here. Hopefully maybe something surprises us. We actually end up getting him at what we consider now a discount, and he's able to give us some big weeks here. We are heading into round 16. Again, we still have a lot of guys in the green in terms of some of our late round targets here. Guys who I really like, guys who I think Shawn really likes, and who we are, just completely in on with these next couple of picks. If we look at our roster construction from the standpoint of positional and the number of players we have there, we're currently sitting on 2 tight ends, 3 quarterbacks. We have 5 wide receivers, and we have also 5 running backs at this time, which is now where I think these last cut of picks is going to really determine how we end up building out this team outright with the next couple of picks and where we think we need to have more of than other spots. Shawn, we have a couple more picks to go before we're here. Where are you feeling like we need to kind of focus on over these next couple of rounds with making sure that we have a proper balance of the different positions to give this roster the most upside and make it as strong as we possibly can?
Well, I would probably have preferred a 7 wide receiver, 6 running back build. But one of the things that we did see was that the opposite of that would work. And even something as limited at wide receiver as 5 wide receivers, if you go with them early, as we have done, is something that has historically given some pretty good win rates, even though that's on a small sample because not many people are approaching it in that way. So I think that the positional value is going to determine a lot what we go with here. If some of our favorite guys make it through, it seems like, okay, well, 16, 17, 18, those are throwaway types of rounds, but you can lose the players you're targeting, like we just did with Hubbard there, right before your pick, and it will change the direction you want to go. We could also go with that 3rd tight end in round 17 or 18 if the guy that we've been eyeing a little bit is still there. So I like what we've done to this point because we really do have a lot of flexibility in terms of the players and most importantly, the positions that we draft in these last 3 picks.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. Losing Hubbard there definitely hurts. I don't think that. So where I'm at with this, and I'll lay out my thoughts here real quick, see what you think. With the tight end who we have targeting right now, he's a player who I really like at this spot. I think that he's going undervalued, particularly based on the argument that you made for him earlier in our conversation. I like the tight end here. We probably don't need to take him here. We could go with another running back. If we were to go with another running back, who would you be looking for here? We don't need to necessarily leak the tight end out unless we plan on taking him at this spot.
Well, we do have a running back who is still on the board that you had in yellow, but he's now several rounds below where he normally goes. Does that change how you view him at all compared to the 3 sort of late round running backs? Where we at here, we have 1 running back who's fallen. We have 3 late round running backs we like. We have 1 late round wide receiver that I especially like and you were okay with as we were putting this together. And then we have a late round tight end. How does that running back fit in for you at this point?
So if the running back we're talking about is Tariq Cohen, which I believe it is, because I did have him in yellow, I think that he fits this construction pretty nicely, mainly because right now we're kind of looking at guys who are going to contribute weeks for us. And they may not always necessarily be the consistent producers based on where we're kind of building this out. I think Cohen is an interesting player because he doesn't give us a lot of rushing upside, but he can catch a lot of passes. I'm fine with Cohen here in this spot if that's who you're referencing.
Okay, well, let's go Cohen, and then we have 3 more late round running backs that we really like, and probably at least one of them will fall all the way out of the draft. And so we have a lot of flexibility with the direction that we go here in round 17 as well.
Yep. Sorry, I'm just taking a look at some couple of things here. And then we'll get ready to make these next few picks. I mean, all the guys you have in the queue, at this point in time, I guess what we would really want to talk about if we're considering another running back here, we have a couple guys here who we have labeled in green who could go a little bit later on, and then we also have a couple of guys here who are in yellow who I know that we like as well. We use a very nuanced approach here of just simply doing red, yellow, green, and even orange for kind of the middle between that red and yellow spot, where it's not quite a guy who we hate, but not someone we feel the most confident on. We do have a few guys who we do feel pretty confident on as late round running back targets. As we come around to these targets here, Shawn, are you fine with waiting on tight end for another pick? I think I probably am, based on what I'm expecting to happen coming up here. But if you want to get our guy, realizing that we have running backs who are probably still going to be available, I'm fine with getting that tight end too.
Where are you on the receiver that we have left?
On the receiver that we have left, I'm absolutely fine with that. The receiver that we have left, I think, offers a lot of big play upside. I think that he would be kind of a fun guy to have on this team, where when you think about guys in terms of the phrase, I like them better in best ball, I think he kind of perfectly fits that phrase based on what he's able to do. And I think that, I think he even makes for an interesting pairing with some other players who we have on our roster right now. We had talked about that a little bit off air. If that's where you're leaning towards with that pick, I'm absolutely fine with that too. I don't think that there's any need to necessarily rush on some of the other players we have sitting there. Where are you at on that? Because I'm absolutely fine with going that direction if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, so do you have any preference big picture now in terms of this third tight end, in terms of running back, wide receiver? If we take another running back, I think there's some good running back values. We arguably get a little bit overweight on that position, even though that we waited on it. We might want to go wide receiver and tight end to finish, in which case, if we take at least one of them right here, we know we won't be wiped out of both of them.
Yeah, so I mean, we currently have, it looks like we have 6 running backs here. That's not that bad. I'm fine with that. I think we still do want to get that third tight end and also that next wide receiver. I'll say whichever one you think is better at wide receiver, tight end, let's go that, and we'll see who comes back to us. But I'm fine with no more running backs. So we went ahead and went with Dalton Schultz, and that's kind of who I was hoping you would go with. We had talked about Schultz off air earlier, and Shawn made a good point that I think is something that's worth considering as we look to build teams later on this offseason, which was that Schultz obviously had a very good season last year after Blake Jarwin went down. But if you look at ADPs, the public is much higher on Jarwin, and I don't think that that's necessarily correct. I think that Schultz had a very solid season, and he's also healthy. He's not going to be or he's coming off a season which he was healthy while Jarwin missed time. I think Shawn's point kind of was, and I'll let him explain it a little bit more, but just kind of simply the fact that we saw a player play tight end for the Cowboys last year who was very good. I don't think what they had was necessarily broken, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Dalton Schultz as a tight end 3 here in what's still an elite, high-powered offense as we continue to throw all of our chips in on Dallas, I think could be a very sneaky pick at this point in the draft. So Shawn, when it comes to Schultz and then also Blake Jarwin, did I cover that pretty accurately in terms of how we're viewing him and why we were fine with taking him here over Jarwin much earlier?
Definitely. And there are a lot of extremely sharp fantasy owners who are very high on Jarwin. I don't necessarily think that they're wrong. I'm more looking at it in terms of, and I have a lot of Schultz in Dynasty from last year, and so I follow him pretty closely, read what the beat writers are writing about this tight end depth chart and how Dallas plans to play. Most of the signals seem to suggest this is going to be more of a 50-50 type of split, which might not be ideal for either of them, especially when you have all of those elite wide receivers. At the same time, I think if we're close to 50-50, then I like to continue to get some exposure to Schultz, because the price on him compared to the price on Jarwin, you look at Jarwin goes in round 12 of this draft, there were a lot of very good players we were still looking at in that range. To have picked him there would have been a lot to give up. So we may very well be wrong, but when we're wrong, we want it to be less expensive as opposed to more expensive. So that's the direction we kind of went on this pick.
Right, and that kind of I think even comes back to what we talked about a little bit with the Lindsay pick is if we're wrong, it's a less expensive guy to be wrong on, but we're also getting a guy who we think is a very good player. Maybe if the situation was just a little bit better, a very good player who we're now getting at a price with the hopes that talent kind of shines through situation. With Schultz, hopefully talent shines through situation. Hopefully there's enough there in that Dallas offense in terms of volume for Schultz to still give us some good weeks. But if he doesn't get it for us, then at least we're only losing out on a player who we got in the 17th round instead of the 12th round, which is where Blake Jarwin went. I think that the camp battle between Jarwin and Schultz will be an interesting one to see. Two tight ends in the same offense don't tend to quite pan out, I think, as much as we want to believe that it does. Years ago, it was Gronk and Aaron Hernandez, and I think people kind of revel in that from time to time a little bit too much when it comes to seeing two solid tight ends in the same offense. Even a few years ago, people were talking about that with the Ravens and Hayden Hurst and Mark Andrews, and we know how that turned out. So I think whichever tight end does end up winning the job is certainly going to be the one who we're going to want for fantasy, and I don't think that Jarwin's ADP is as safe a value as Schultz's, realizing that Schultz could inevitably win that job with Jarwin coming off of an injury-filled season and Schultz having a rather good 2020 campaign. Right now, we are in the twilight of this draft, quite literally. We are just a few picks away here from making our final selection of this draft. We just lost one of our running back targets, but I think, Shawn, are we still probably fine with not getting a seventh wide receiver at this point in time, a seventh running back at this point, but going wide receiver with the final pick?
Yeah, we have a couple of wide receivers here. The wide receiver we passed on is still available. We do still have 3 or 4 running backs as well. And so even though losing P. Ryan is disappointing, we have some other options at this spot. I think that P. Ryan selection, though, is a very, very good one where he went at the end of round 17.
Yeah. P. Ryan is a player who kind of came on late in the season after Gio Bernard, I think, was kind of banged up towards the end of the season. Joe Mixon obviously missed most of the season, and P. Ryan got a couple chances to play. He did well. He gave you some usable weeks, and now they brought him back, and he is essentially the backup running back behind Joe Mixon. And if they look to feed him in any given week, should Mixon miss time, I think that P. Ryan is going to be a fine player at that final slot in the draft for the 112. They got him at 17-12 right before the 1801. But I do like P. Ryan there. We're currently sitting on a 5 wide receiver build, I believe it is, with 6 running backs. Shawn did touch on a little bit that 5 wide receiver builds can actually work despite how fragile they may look with so few wide receivers. But where are you leaning towards this last pick, Shawn, given some of the guys that we highlighted earlier as guys who we like now that it's come time to make that final selection?
I like going with the receiver here. I think he's going to be a good pairing with someone we already have. Probably doesn't help us in quite the same way for the overall tournament victory, but will help us get to the playoffs by being a good complement to one of the receivers already on our roster. There are a couple other wide receivers we could go with. There is decent wide receiver value at this point if you're loaded. If you're trying to get guys who you still need to be an impact player for you, then this is a tough range. At the same time, over there at running back, we have 3 guys in the queue. I think any of them will be good. We actually have a couple guys that we have in green sort of lower than them as well that we haven't needed to bring in. I think mixing these guys up in rounds 17 and 18 of drafts over the next couple months is a fun way to look at that. That way, as you build these 0 running back or single elite running back drafts, you have exposure to a lot of the types of guys who could end up being very big pieces of your team in the way a James Robinson was last year, or even someone like a J.D. McKissic.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. I think that some of these running backs we have, it takes one situation for them to all of a sudden rise to the top and turn into that late round value here. We have 33 seconds to pick. Shawn, the wide receiver we wanted is on the board. We have him even in our queue right now. I'm absolutely fine with that pick. I like what you said earlier with how he would pair with one of our other wide receivers who we have. I believe you even outlined his playoff schedule for us in terms of the fantasy playoffs and how that may work out for us down the road, if I remember correctly. We went ahead and decided to go with KJ Hamler. Shawn, can we talk a little bit about the KJ Hamler pick, what it was that you liked about him kind of late in our discussions earlier today, and pairing him with a guy like Jerry Jeudy?
Yeah, so when we look at these wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 picks, especially in a roster that's this deep, now we have a lot of exposure to the Cowboys. We're hoping that works out in that Week 17 game with the Cardinals. We picked more to have a little bit going back the other direction with the Cardinals in the shootout. I think that the Denver Broncos are more talented at wide receiver than the Cowboys are. Now, the big difference there, obviously, is that the Cowboys have one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. The Broncos maybe don't have a quarterback at all. At the same time, Teddy Bridgewater was okay for his fantasy receivers last year, right? DJ Moore, a little bit disappointing, but he scored to the point where if that's disappointing, then he's a very, very good player. Robbie Anderson actually has a little bit of a career renaissance. You have Curtis Samuel making a little bit of a push forward. And so if Drew Lock can't get it done, and we don't really have much reason to believe he can, then I think Bridgewater moves in there, makes some of these guys work. Now, does Bridgewater have the kind of arm that pairs well with a vertical wide receiver like KJ Hamler? Probably not. But I think that Hamler is maybe the most undervalued wide receiver as a talent in the entire NFL. He came in as a top 50 pick in last year's draft. He had a couple of decent games last season, both in terms of creating those big scores, right? He had a game with multiple long touchdowns. He also had a game with a couple of sort of heavy target performances. Now, is he going to see that if Courtland Sutton comes back and is the alpha receiver that we sort of think that he is? Perhaps not. At the same time, I think that this Broncos offense is going to be more explosive than people give it credit for. And if we're talking about sort of a weekly floor and making sure that we have those points, again, it can be easy to focus on the playoffs when you're trying to win $100,000, but you have to get there. And if we look at how that Broncos offense will play out, you're going to have some weeks that Jeudy plays extremely well. You're going to have some weeks, I think, that Hamler will be the guy. When they balance each other out, it can make sure that you have those points at wide receiver and have those points in the flex position. Because of the approach that we've taken, we're going to need to have our wide receivers in the flexes. We can't just write that off and think, okay, our top 4 or 5 guys are going to get it done every week. Now, we hope that Mike Gesicki also contributes in the flex. We wouldn't have taken him there if we didn't think that he had that upside. But when we look at our particular build with these running backs potentially breaking out, scoring more points than people think, you're not going to need to know when they're going to score the points in this format. It's still something, though, where we're mostly hoping that those running back selections will cover the 2 running back slots. We need some other firepower in the flex position.
Yeah. I think that's kind of one of the things that is unique and fun with the FFPC drafts is it has that flex spot, but then you can consider guys like the tight end, like Gesicki in this case, as potential players who are going to fill that flex spot for you, where you otherwise might not get that in a normal fantasy league. I think that sometimes when you're looking at a PPR league or even a half PPR league and you have that flex spot, the tight end, if you have a tight end in the flex spot, you probably didn't have a very good week at your other position players. In the case of a guy like Mike Gesicki, if he's getting in your flex spot in a tight end premium league like the FFPC is, I think that getting him in your flex spot could possibly mean that even if you did have a decent week at wide receiver, you're still getting Gesicki in there at the flex spot just because he's going to give you those high weeks. And I mean, you made a great point. I completely forgot about Hamler as far as his draft slot goes, being a top 50 pick. This is a guy who's probably going to see the field for Denver and play hopefully a pretty good amount. He had a couple moments last season where, he definitely looked to be living up to the talent. Hopefully a full season, healthy, possibly with Teddy Bridgewater, which I think is really going to be the player who kind of drives Denver wide receivers to the level of success that we're hoping that they find in 2021. I think Teddy Bridgewater will hopefully be a nice quarterback for both Jeudy and Hamler as we make those picks. Really quick, we'll go over this team. Any thoughts on the team before I kind of rattle off what we got here, Shawn, and take a look at it?
No, I like what we've done. I think if there are potential hiccups, having the 3 quarterbacks is not necessarily the direction we wanted to go. And not being able to get Thomas and how that has not just losing him, but it has a little bit of a trickle effect. Now, you can't set your draft up to where you have to be able to get one guy right about ADP or else it doesn't work. And I think that the pivots work nicely. So I like that the team that we have there, because Dallas has a couple of games with Washington in that playoff time period, we were hoping to have some Washington players, specifically receiving types of talent, to come back in that and give us sort of multiple upside within those games for multiple weeks. That didn't pan out, but otherwise, I really like how this draft developed for us.
It's funny because I know we had talked about before we wrote the articles and got that stuff up on RotoViz that we might be concerned that having the articles up there will give people too much to work with, but we thought it would be fun to do. We didn't really mention much about Washington at all. That was kind of something that we took a look at late, and we thought we were going to find some good value there with those Washington picks, and everyone kind of just on the football team went off a little bit earlier than expected. We couldn't quite get that as far as how our plans worked out pre-draft. That would have been a fun one to have happen. But I do feel really good about what we were able to do with Dallas and even Judy and Hamler. I think that would be fun. Hopefully some of these running backs fall into situations where they're at least seeing some weekly snaps and opportunities. And I think ETN really hitting is going to be perhaps a pick that's going to wind up being a giant steal for us in this draft if he does what we expect him to do. Real quickly here, I'm just going to rattle off the team, and then I think we might do a couple quick questions with Shawn if he's up for answering them. We have our roster constructed with a Darren Waller tight end pick out of the 104. We then went back-to-back wide receivers with A.J. Brown and C.D. Lamb. Again, really looking to capitalize, particularly as you'll see down the line on Dallas. Travis Etienne, a player who we're both high on, given his first-round draft selection, the fact that he will hopefully be on the field a lot for Jacksonville. Dak Prescott, Jerry Jeudy, Tyler Boyd, Mike Gesicki, and then Tony Pollard, Darrell Henderson, Trevor Lawrence, Rashad Penny, Rondale Moore, a wide receiver who Shawn and I both like heading into this season, Derek Carr, Phillip Lindsay, Tariq Cohen, Dalton Schultz, and then KJ Hamler. I really like this team a lot. Certainly, you find out that you can have the best laid plans in the world, but if things start going unexpected, you got to pivot. Very thankful to have you on here, Shawn, to do this team with me, to have a little bit of fun. Hopefully everyone learned a lot during this draft. Hopefully Shawn had some fun as well. I got a couple of questions from people that I posted on Twitter. I'm not sure how many you want to get onto, Shawn. I'm just going to read them off, and then you let me know what we got to do here. I'm not sure of your time, but if you're cool with answering a couple of best ball questions that I posed on Twitter, we'll see what people have here for us. The first question, I'm just going to go down the line. This is actually from Amar, fellow RotoViz writer. He had asked Shawn, if you were forced to take a running back in the dead zone, who are one or two running backs that you would consider in the dead zone spot at this point in time in the season? And then someone else said guaranteed it's a rookie. Our draft kind of reflects that. Would that be pretty spot on with the answer and then what we did tonight?
I think that's accurate. And we also had Dobbins, someone I would consider probably more, if we're in a different spot early in the third round where we were, he fell to us. We didn't necessarily like him there. But if you're in some of these drafts, and I think that you are going to see individual drafts where running backs fall. Overall, we know running backs are still going very, very early. If you're in a draft where they fall, then I think toward the end of the third round, he becomes a little bit more interesting. In this draft here, right, we had Chubb and Mixon fall to the end of the second round. It's not impossible that you're going to have some of those things happen in the third, fourth round with some of these other second-year guys. When I'm looking at taking a running back in the dead zone, I'm looking to have that upside of someone who next year would be a top 5 pick. I think that those young guys have some of that upside. With Dobbins, I think the Baltimore offense is going to be one of the most interesting offenses to follow this season. I think that they will pass a little bit more. That doesn't necessarily help Dobbins. They've talked a little bit about throwing more to the running backs. We'll see if that develops. There's plenty of room for skepticism there, but if it does happen, Dobbins should be the beneficiary. I think that this team is just going to score so many points that the concerns that fantasy owners very justifiably have about the way the volume works for some of the most important people. You have Dobbins, you have Mark Andrews. He went very early in this draft. Definitely an Andrews believer. I like that pick. We were all over Andrews last year. And one of the funny things about Andrews is that he gets the rap for having this very disappointing 2020 season, but really it was solid, right? I mean, if that's, again, a disappointment, then you're talking about a very talented guy. So we look at these Baltimore players. I think that they could pan out very nicely. Even some of the receivers. We were kind of on different Baltimore receivers. That wasn't a direction that we were going to go in this draft. But I think that you could see some of those Baltimore receivers really generate value at ADP as well.
Yeah, I think Bateman is a guy who I particularly come around on later on drafts. He's going after Marquise Brown. I think he's very likely to lead all Ravens wide receivers and targets. Next question I have here is from Pat Corain. I think this is actually a pretty good one here. Curious for Shawn's thoughts on hyperfragile in this format. It seems far less utilized here than on underdog. I don't know how much drafting you've done on Underdog, Shawn. I'm sure that you are at least familiar with one of the hot topics on Underdog right now is this idea of a 4 running back build in what is also an 18-round best ball format, half PPR. A lot of people are kind of going crazy over the hyper fragile build right now. And you're seeing that pop up a lot. Where would you be at a hyper fragile running back build in a format like this on the FFPC?
I think that you can definitely go that direction. You look at the start that I think it was Nelson had, where he does get those guys who fall to Mixon, Chubb there. I think you could arguably go with just those guys. Now he has 3 running backs he takes later. Michael Carter, an interesting player, maybe not in the 6th round, although again, Carter is someone who probably will outperform the expectations that a lot of us have for him. So I like it here. I think that if your running backs stay healthy, which is a little bit what you're gambling on in the first place with that, I think that if you draft those guys early and you're thinking, okay, well, that's the upside. Those players have big workloads. Certainly Mixon may be a little bit less exciting than Chubb, but the workload should be better, right? So you have this potential for a huge score. If you're taking that, then I really like the idea of going very wide receiver heavy with some of those other picks to make sure that you also have those wide receiver spots with more upside, I think, than if you take your more traditional builds. And then I think it also gives you a little bit more upside at the flex position. Sure, you're definitely exposing yourself to injury and maybe starting to take some zeros, which you never want to do. At the same time, when we're talking about, number one, just winning your league and being in that top 3 and advancing, and then being in the top couple as you go through those playoffs, it's really a matter of having those guys have stayed healthy. And if they do, then I think that you want to go more that direction than have some balance.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the general premise behind the hyper-fragile zero-RB approach. I think perhaps maybe 6 running backs here with the 3 out the gate is probably a little rich for me. But I think the way it started in terms of how you would essentially set up a hyper-fragile build looks very good with McCaffrey, Mixon, and Chubb. Let's find another question here. Internet influencer Peter Overzet posed a question of, curious to hear Shawn's thoughts on stacking, because I know it's not something he prioritizes in football guys or main event, but curious if he feels different for large field best ball. Where are you at on stacking? We talked a little bit about this earlier, but if we want to dive a little bit deeper on that, kind of comparing football guys and main events to best ball, I think maybe that would be kind of a good little angle to take there.
I like to just get the best players. And if you can get a stack, it definitely can make a difference. I think that sometimes the ones that work out for you are based on luck. I think it was a Josh McCown, if I have the right McCown even, Alshon Jeffrey stack or pairing that allowed my team to win the NFFC primetime all of those years ago. The backup quarterback actually being pressed into service, having a huge week 15 game, I think it was, in that format. If it all works out for you, that you have those guys come into play that way, then I think that it's a no-brainer if you're trying to make sure that you have, all you have to do is think to Stephon Diggs and Josh Allen last year in week 16 and how that can happen. At the same time, I think that it was a Josh Allen team versus a Stephon Diggs team that finished 1-2. And I may not be remembering it correctly, but I think that Diggs at the very end, in a come-from-behind victory because the wide receivers score more points than the quarterbacks on those touchdowns, I think it was Diggs who actually delivered the $500,000 over Josh Allen. So you don't necessarily have to have the stacks. You want to have exposure to the best players. One of the things that we see here as well, and we talked about it some already on the show, is that some of the best stacks for winning those individual weeks in the playoffs may be not the best ball stacks for winning your individual league. So you can get on the Best Ball Win Rate Explorer. You can play with some of those things, look at the stacks and how they work in individual leagues, and see how you want to play that. See if the stack that you like for sort of a 1-week DFS type experience is the same one that's going to allow you to get there in the first place.
Awesome. Let me get into another question here. Let's see. All right, this is an interesting one. This is from ZMC at Buffalo Hotspurs. It says, who do you hate picking but keep picking, and what's the weakest 2 quarterback combo you would roll with. So I guess what he's asking, who's a player that you don't feel good about taking, but you can't help but take him when he's there? And I guess the question is, how late would you drop back in the draft to get 2 quarterbacks who maybe aren't necessarily the best pairing, but you feel confident enough going with it?
Yeah, I just don't draft guys that I don't like. And so I don't necessarily go for quite as much roster diversity as some players do. I like to be pretty heavy on my guys in any given year, knowing that sometimes that's going to mean that I have a down season, but when I have the up seasons, they tend to be really big. Because, for example, in a 2020, I'm not avoiding Diggs anywhere, right? I mean, that value there, even if we hadn't been as right, the value still would have been extreme. And so I want him on every single team. My teams tend to be centered around a smaller group of guys than the way some other high volume players do it. The other question about these quarterbacks, I would feel comfortable going with a Carr Fitzpatrick team. That's kind of the other quarterback that we really wanted there, Fitzpatrick. We made some different choices in that round 12, round 13 area to make sure that we got more. But I feel comfortable with going those guys. I mean, Ryan Fitzpatrick, I think at this point is really a no-brainer, just in general, but especially for this format. That was a great pick in the middle of round 14.
Yeah. I think that is probably about where I would be at on that too. I think it's one of those things where even though we can sit here and say right now we feel good about doing something like that, I don't know that you'd ever actually catch me doing that. But I think that's where I would be at on that too. I think that both Fitzpatrick and Carr can give you a nice back and forth, at least hopefully, of quarterback 1 weeks, and I think that they're probably both locks to start as long as they're healthy. Another question here is from Frank Duffy. He says, "Okay, I do have a question. In his article on winning this thing, Shawn details his win rates for 2 running backs, 3 running backs, and 4 running backs through the first 7 picks. Has he done the same for 0 or 1 running back?" I'm going to open up the article real quick, if that's okay, just if we want to try to get down to that point. But Shawn, have you done that? Is that something you've looked into at all? Where are you at with that?
Yeah, so the follow-up article, and it goes a little bit into our plan for this draft, is that the 1 running back is actually quite a bit better still. Right. And we see that a lot when you're looking across the different best ball formats. All of the best ball formats have different quirks to them that you do need to understand and be willing to take advantage of, or at least adjust to. But almost all of them are very favorable for some type of 1 running back draft early. And the more tight ends that you add, the better. Now, one of the things that we have to keep in mind as we're looking at this is the tight is, early tight end and multiple relatively early tight end is very conclusively the way to play it based on the last 3, 4, 5 years have played out. Now, that's partly related to just a handful of players, though, right? I mean, if Travis Kelce doesn't do what he does, if Darren Waller doesn't do what he does, then you're going to get some different types of results. And we want to be aware of that as it relates to constructions that rely on just 1 or 2 guys, as opposed to when we're looking at how running backs play out, we can be pretty comfortable saying that the dead zone has underperformed. When we look at the way a wide receiver heavy build will work, we can be pretty comfortable that those guys are going to allow you to dominate the flex positions. It's going to give you a team that has a high floor and a high ceiling. At the tight end position, we're really relying on a handful of guys. Now, the other part of that is simply that those guys do gap the field at their positions by so much that we see that reflected in the win rate. So we know that a 1 running back approach is better. We know that the tight end approach is better. We're betting on that and gambling on that happening in this season with the way that we went with Waller and sticking with Etienne as our 1 running back selection. One of the things I do like about it is that you do have some flexibility to go after those guys. If you have a draft slot that's in the second half instead of the first half, then there are some things you can do with going after Hawkinson, going after Fant, going after Gesicki. Maybe a Hawkinson, Fant, Gesicki team is more exciting in that there's some untapped potential there. If those guys break out, we talked about how loaded Denver is. It could be a little bit of a problem for Fant that he just has so many wide receivers on his team to deal with on an offense that even if Bridgewater takes a step forward, you still have some volume, you still have some just scoring total touchdowns within the offense concerns. At the same time, I like some of those guys and the potential for them to take the step forward. And one of the things when you look at that, you're thinking, okay, well, there's a lot more uncertainty than if you take a Kelsey or a Waller. At the same time, when we're looking at tournaments, what we're really looking for is that next guy, the next Waller who you're not paying for as a top 5 player. Once you've paid for him as a top 5 player, then you burn most of the value. You're saying, okay, I do want to have a tight end heavy build, but you're not necessarily expecting to win your league based on it because you paid as though it's already going to happen. And so, if you do have a draft position in the second half, we know there are some big disadvantages to that because you don't have access to those top running backs. And there's no way around it. If McCaffrey has a huge season like he did in 2019, I mean, he's going to determine how the whole year goes. If Alvin Kamara is not hurt by the quarterback change and has a season like last year, he's going to determine how the season goes. If Barkley bounces back, and I mean, he's one of those picks with just such a gigantic range of outcomes. If he can be what he was as a rookie, then he'll determine how the season goes. You don't necessarily have access to that if you have a pick in the second half or definitely in the final third, but you might be able to do some of these tight end heavy approaches where, yeah, I mean, you're still banking on things happening that haven't been demonstrated yet. But if we're talking about what will be the sort of discussion 6 months from now, the breakout tight end, if there is one, will be a big determiner of how this season and how this tournament plays out, who wins the $100,000.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think too, recently it's kind of become a little bit more trendy to try to find that late round tight end who you really think could be that Waller, because we've just seen it now a couple of years in a row with Waller and Thomas. Now I'm kind of also trying to find myself those tight ends who I think could be that as well. And in this case, like you said, really make the difference in a tournament. Real quick here, we'll make this the last question. I actually have another quick one too. So we'll get into 2 more real quick here. With everyone playing with the same rankings and roster builds, and with ADPs tightening up, how do you zigzag from the field, or do you stay the course?
Well, one of the things that Zach and I have been talking a lot about this week is that when you use or you pull up some of the best approaches in the roster construction explorers, you run into a little bit of frustration because the number of players who are doing everything right at all of the different positions are so limited. Now, partly it's not because people don't necessarily know what to do. It's because once you get into a draft, it's difficult to execute even if you spent a long time preparing. We saw that with our draft here tonight, where if the tight ends that you're targeting, because there just aren't that many tight ends in the first 10 rounds. And so if you miss on the guy you want, it's not like you can just take the next guy like you can at running back or wide receiver. So it can be difficult to execute some of these best builds, but I just don't think that people really are playing correctly yet, at least with best ball, right? And so the way that you can sort of zag is simply to read the articles, follow the stuff that Mike has built. It's never ideal to have Mike drafting right next to us, when he obviously is the overall best ball guru and has built all of these great things that we have, all of the fantastic wealth of information from now. But I think you want to just take the best practice, take the best approach. That's going to work out for you. It's going to create win rates that are definitely good enough to make money and then place you into the playoffs of these different tournaments where you could potentially win a very, very big pot. I do think that the other thing that you can do a little bit is that, we know what the ADPs are. We know where the guys are going. One of the things that we did in this draft was simply to go by our rankings and not worry about the fact that maybe we're half a round or a round early. Because when you get to the end of your draft, you don't want to say, okay, well, I got value by ADP, but I didn't get value by my own rankings, right? So we want to have humility in terms of how we approach that. So much of what we do on RotoViz, both in terms of being very aware of the results from the roster construction explorers, from the best ball win rate explorer, but then also some of these other structural things with zero running back, with single elite running back. The reason that we do structural drafting in the first place is to have humility about how these drafts are going to play out and know that, okay, well, in our minds, it sticks when we were right about somebody, right? It sticks when you were right about Jamal Charles in 2013. It sticks when you were right about Stephon Diggs in 2020. It sticks all of these zero running back candidates that you put on your list and then they jump up and score in the top 10 points. sometimes it can be harder to remember all the things that you were wrong on until you go back and you read all your articles and you're like, well, I just, how did I have success last season when I clearly didn't know how it was going to play out? And the answer to that is that you follow these structural approaches. But then within that too, we have knowledge about how ADP is broken in terms of running back to wide receiver. We can emphasize that. We also know that there are some elements where early in drafts, young players are still a little bit undervalued in many cases, not all cases. I mean, there are going to be some guys like Pitts and Chase where it's sort of hard to foresee them blowing away those ADPs, right? But we know that some of the young guys are undervalued early. We know that some of the veterans are undervalued late. We want to draft by our boards as opposed to ADP if we get caught in situations where you can't do both. One of the things that we've talked a lot about on RotoViz Overtime, for example, is in these RV Triflex Dynasty startups, you can trade down. And trading down is a fantastic way to maximize your value. It also allows you to deal with these situations like we were in round 6, where we're sitting there, we don't really like anybody, right? You're sitting there in round 11, we didn't like anybody. Those were sort of the 2 places in our draft where if a trade down was possible, that we would have looked at that. And so depending on the type of league that you're playing, best ball, redraft, dynasty, you want to make sure that you're taking advantage of whatever the opportunities are in that particular format to deal with any area that you come to in a draft where you don't like your choices.
That's an awesome answer. I think it gives you a little bit to think about, especially when it comes to, I think the idea of zigging when other people are zagging is so common that I think that the one thing that, like Shawn said, keep in mind is those rankings. I am far more beholden to ADP, I think, than I would like to be now that I have gotten this opportunity to kind of talk some shop with you behind the scenes, be more mindful of different things. I also hang out on Twitter, so I get to see people say, like, you're crazy for taking a player X around early or a round and a half early, which not necessarily that we did that here, but when you take a look at certain things and you see that how people respond to some of your picks, I think you begin to second guess maybe what you did. But really, when you're sticking with your own rankings, I think that's what will help you diversify your rosters, in your builds in these kinds of tournaments. So I do think that that's a very good point to make, Shawn, on that topic of zigging when other people are zagging. Last question I'll ask. This one came in the video chat. It is from Sal Stefanelli of 4for4.com. He wants to know, Shawn, who's the best last round quarterback target? Do you need me to pull this up here? I think we still have some here because there's a lot of guys hanging out there in that last round. Who do you think is the best last round target? If we were taking a quarterback in this 3 QB build in the last round, who would we have probably gone with?
Well, since we drafted 2 Denver Broncos and we're talking about Teddy Bridgewater as being the guy who's going to have to get that done, then Bridgewater probably looks good there. I don't necessarily mind Mac Jones. I think that, your concern is simply that, he doesn't start the season. The things that I've seen coming out of camp, and I think that especially with the Patriots, maybe you can't always trust that. I think that they're going to do whatever it takes to get back, especially after, they were very generous about Tom Brady winning the Super Bowl with the Buccaneers. Probably it doesn't even matter because that Bill Belichick doesn't really care about anything in life other than winning that Super Bowl. He's going to do what it takes to get back there to try and win that. He's got the more motivation with what Tom Brady was able to accomplish last season. If that means starting Cam Newton for the first, 4 games, first 10 games, I guess I just think that with a lot of the stuff that was coming out with Mac Jones late in the process, how well he played last season, how relatively strong of a fit he looks like for that Patriots offense, and then just the early practice reports you're hearing where he already looks a lot better as a passer than Cam Newton. I think that he'll play early. I think that he'll play relatively well. If you're talking about drafting someone in round 20, then Mac Jones, Teddy Bridgewater, I don't think those names will necessarily hurt you. They would need to be part of a 3 quarterback build in all likelihood, but there's some upside there, maybe even ahead of the player that we took. So I like those guys.
Yeah, Mac Jones has been the guy for me who I've been taking late in some drafts. Like you said, they would have to be in 3 quarterback builds. So if I am getting Mac Jones, it is a 3 quarterback build. Only other guy who I think is interesting, and maybe just because Trey Lance is just so raw as a rookie. He only played in 1 game last season. I think even Jimmy Garoppolo might be an interesting player as a late round flyer, just on the off chance that maybe he starts enough games to return some value for you there, or he shocks the world and starts, almost the entire season, kind of like an Alex Smith, Patrick Mahomes situation from 2017, where Mahomes didn't play until I think it was the last game of the season. And Alex Smith led the way. That would probably also take the 49ers having a pretty good record, and Jimmy Garoppolo being a serviceable quarterback. But I think Jimmy Garoppolo is interesting too. But Mac Jones would be the guy for me if I'm looking at guys who I think could help me get to it in the back end of the season. I think Mac Jones is a guy who I'd be looking at. Shawn, any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here?
Well, I wanted to hear your best pick for our draft here. Where did you think what pick did the draft really hinge on? And is there anything that you would do differently? One of the things that happens, doing these co-owning is fantastic. It can also be a little bit tricky, right? Because if you're trying to have a conversation within the course of really, you have a 60-second clock, but it comes down to making the decision more or less in 30, 35 seconds. It can be difficult if players come off the board that you were targeting right ahead of your pick. So was there anything that you would do differently now that we've had a few minutes to sit back and look at it and see where some of the other players have gone?
Yeah, so I will come right out and admit this is probably easily the sharpest draft room I have ever been in. So there was a lot of things for me to consider as this was taking place. I think the pick that really just does stand out to me, because we're talking about single elite running back, as being a viable strategy, and I think we kind of approached that here. I think that our draft and the success of it could possibly really hinge on Etienne being kind of that single elite running back role who we took in the 4th round, where other guys were taking people in the 1st and 2nd rounds. You kind of comped him to Alvin Kamara and said that he's a guy who might be able to give us something in that likeness, but we got him 3 rounds later. So Etienne really does stand out to me as a legitimate pick that if he hits, and if AJ Brown and CeeDee Lamb are doing what we expect them to do as our top 2 wide receivers off the board, then I think that could be a very strong trio up front. If I was looking at something differently, I have to pay close attention to it here for a second. But if I was looking at something differently, I think maybe I would have considered a different running back over Tyler Boyd there. We didn't really get to pair Boyd with Joe Burrow, but at the same time, I also don't hate that Boyd pick just because of what I think he'd be able to do for us in terms of, hopefully seeing a lot of targets in an offense that's going to be throwing a lot. I think that's kind of where I'm at on it. I like the Gesicki pick. If maybe Tony Pollard could be a risky pick if for some reason Zeke ends up doing more than we are perhaps expecting him to. If Leonard Fournette ends up being a guy who sees more of that role that we saw him get in the playoffs, then we may regret going Pollard over Fournette. But overall, I like this draft in general. We talked about James Conner too. We may hate ourselves some of the weeks where we went Pollard over Conner here. I know we did say we liked him. In hindsight, maybe that would have been where I would have changed it. What do you think as far as that goes?
Yeah, I think that so much it's going to come down to those picks in round 6 and round 7, because when you're loading up on the wide receivers, you do need them to score, right? So when we talk about zero running back, we always talk about trying to get 6 of the top 15 guys. I think that it's easy to miss on how much value that really gives to you. So number 1, you're picking a lot of wide receivers early. Number 2, you have a profile that you like, and you're picking the guys that you think are a little bit undervalued. Both Jeudy and Boyd are undervalued. Are they undervalued in a way where they can break out to the high-end level that we're looking for? Jeudy's someone I think could be much, much, much more expensive next season. There's a lot of risk there because Courtland Sutton could come back and be, probably not an AJ Brown quite to that level, but he could be someone in that mold. If he does that, there's just not going to be enough left over. If Jeudy can't fix the problems he had catching last season, then he's not going to get to that level. But when you look beyond the raw numbers for Jeudy, there were a lot of very promising things there to where he could be that guy who's not very far behind Lamb, behind Justin Jefferson. where he was looked at coming in was similar to those guys. I was maybe a little bit skeptical that he was that close. And then, you see him drop those passes and you think, okay, well, I was right. But when you go and you look at it more closely, then you realize, okay, well, it's right there. I mean, drops are not super predictive. I mean, there are some elements of them that are, depending on other aspects of the guy's profile. But all he has to do is catch those passes, take that next step. We see those year 2 wide receivers so often make this huge jump. If he does that, then I think that we're sitting pretty. Boyd probably doesn't fit quite as well with some of the things that we want to do later. Maybe even something like take a big reach for Laviska Shenault might have been the play with Chark off of the board there. We had talked about the other 2 guys we were looking at when we picked Judy were Smith-Schuster and Chark. Neither one of them made it back. But Shenault could be the player with the Jaguars and with the Trevor Lawrence pick there at QB who ends up really being the guy. He's probably one of the most buzzed about players of the offseason. So perhaps that would have been a better fit. It's easy to second guess, though, when you go back through and you look at exactly where players did come off the board. Maybe we should have just taken them instead of waiting. At the same time, I really like this team. It would have been a lot better with Logan Thomas. If Logan Thomas had lasted one more pick, we've got to send Mike some hate mail of some sort for making that selection there. But no, with that not being an option there in round 6, I think this is a really fun team to have. And one of the things that I like to do, we had the question of, who do I not really like but keep drafting? One of the things that I always just really try and do when I come out of the drafts is to have players that I like, teams that I like, and I'm going to enjoy rooting for during the season. And, even to the extent of when Blair and I drafted that extreme 0 running back draft last year in the FFPC main event, I came out of it and I was like, the FFPC, you need to have that one running back who can really be a foundation piece for you. The first running back we drafted was in round 11. Hines ended up being sort of our running back for most of the season. We started playing McKissick with him late. That team won the league, finished 31st overall, right? And so I think that a lot of times if you draft a team that you like and that you think is fun, the chances that team outperforms are good. Whereas if you get into a draft and you get into a situation where you're like, okay, well, I just don't have it, right? I know that the percentages are in favor of single elite running back. I know the percentages are in favor of 0 running back. But if I don't get a guy here, then I've essentially thrown $125 away because you have to have somebody. Then you start making picks that you don't like. The chances of that team outperforming are not great, right? So draft the guys that you like, the guys that you have confidence in. Trust that the system will work, especially if you're playing, more than one team. I think that, if you're new to it, you're looking at single elite running back, you're looking at 0 running back, and you go that route and your team is bad, then, you'll never try it again. You'll kind of get locked out of this approach that works. Whereas if you take sort of a normal approach and your team's bad, you'll just say, well, not everybody can win, and I got unlucky with injuries, right? You won't say, well, it was the approach that knocked you out.
Yeah.
So, you want to make sure that you're prepared enough to draft guys that you like, to have a team that you'll enjoy rooting for, and, to not put yourself in that situation where you're going to determine like all of your future draft strategy based on one league or one team. But within that, my recommendation is just, draft your guys, draft them within a structure that has a high likelihood of working, and then enjoy rooting for them during the season.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a great point. Definitely more fun when you have vested interest in players you like as players and not so much players you like as ADP numbers, hoping that you're constantly watching that value that you think you capture in the draft. It's okay to go out and get your guys and have some fun. If you really believe in them, hopefully they do well. Again, Shawn made an excellent point just a little bit ago too about getting his guys, and when he does that and he drafts players who he likes, he might have a couple down years, but when he hits in a big way, which is obviously what we're trying to do in any league, with especially being the case of a tournament format like this. I think that's kind of it for everything. I would super thankful for Shawn to come on here and do this with me. Very excited to have you on and a chance to talk some best ball, both here with everybody else and then also in the chat leading up to this. I think that I'm a better player for today having happened. So thank you so much for coming on and doing that and taking time out of your day to do that. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Thank you everyone for the great questions that you had, for drafting along, for subscribing to RotoViz, reading all of our work. You can always check out Shawn's work on RotoViz along with Blair Andrews and and myself. Lots of awesome things happening on RotoViz, Best Ball Tools, all that stuff. Again, this is Shawn Siegele. I am Zach Kruger. Thank you for joining us on episode 7 of Roster Locked, a Best Ball show. We will be back next week. And until then, have a great evening.